fog clings low to the ground as you step into the narrow clearing, the cold of an early April morning in the year 1000 CE cutting straight through your cloak. You can smell damp earth, wood smoke and livestock before you even see the cluster of thatched roofs ahead. A handful of villagers gather near a crooked wooden cross, whispering nervously as the church bell tolls, not for a feast, not for a wedding, but because someone swears they saw a streak of fire across the sky last night. You can feel their unease in the way they clutch their shawls tighter, as if celestial oddities are a direct threat to their crops. In a way, they believe they are. You stand among them, feeling the mud suck at your boots, and for a moment you realise you're in a world where every sunrise is uncertain, every omen is meaningful, and every person lives only a few bad harvests away from disaster. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll get a front row seat to 1,000 years of chaos, power plays, and the occasional suspiciously enthusiastic monk. If you're ready to glide through medieval Europe 1,000 years in 20 minutes, get comfortable, breathe slow, and let your eyes rest. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Consider it your personal timestamp in this 1,000-year journey. Settle in, traveller of centuries. Let's begin. You move forward from that village crossroads into the wider continent, letting the faint bell echo fade behind you. Europe in the year 1000 looks nothing like the map in your schoolbook. Instead of defined borders, you're staring at a patchwork of territories, some barely more than clusters of villages sworn to a local lord, others shaped by old tribal identities, a few punched through with ambitious kings who claim more authority than they can actually enforce. The Holy Roman Empire sprawls across Central Europe like a half-organised quilt. France is technically a kingdom, but practically a scattering of independent nobles. England is in and out of Scandinavian control, and the Iberian Peninsula is divided between Christian and Muslim realms that push each other back and forth with the seasons. And all across it, the population is small, shockingly small. Under 50 million people on an entire continent. You could fit all of medieval Europe's population into one modern megacity, and still have room left for a football stadium. As you walk the dirt paths, you see how empty the land feels. Forests dominate, wolves roam. Travel is slow and dangerous, and the idea of a nation-state is centuries away from meaning anything. What you do have, however, is authority layered like an unstable cake. Lords rule peasants, bigger lords rule lords, kings rule, theoretically everyone, but in practice, only the spots they can physically ride to without being murdered. Church officials hover over all of it with their own hierarchy, creating an entirely separate ladder of authority that occasionally cooperates with secular rulers, occasionally challenges them, and occasionally just confuses everyone. You pass a group of armoured riders thundering down a path, but don't mistake them for disciplined knights of later centuries. These men are local enforcers, half protectors and half problems, who follow the orders of the nearest fortress owner. Their armour is mismatched metal and leather, their horses smaller than the glossy steeds you expect, and their faces stern. One of them eyes you suspiciously because travelling without a known lord's protection makes you look like a spy, a criminal, or a person with a death wish. In medieval Europe, those three categories often overlap. The riders disappear toward a wooden Motte and Bailey fort on the hill, its palisade walls already needing repair. Below it, you watch peasants work narrow strips of land that look barely capable of feeding them. They use heavy wooden ploughs that creak under the weight of each furrow, pulled by oxen moving with the speed of creatures who know there is no point rushing. The soil is unpredictable. Too wet one year, too dry the next, and the survival of the entire village depends on the whims of the weather. One bad frost, famine, one failed harvest, desperation, two failed harvests. People start eyeing bark and grass in a way that suggests culinary creativity has gone too far. You wander on, following a track lined with hedges, until you emerge into a settlement that actually counts as a town by medieval standards. It has maybe a few hundred residents, which in this era is considered positively metropolitan. You smell tanneries long before you reach the marketplace, a scent that could strip paint off walls if medieval walls actually had paint. Workshops hum with activity, blacksmiths hammering horseshoes, potters shaping clay, bakers pulling coarse loaves from ovens. But even here wealth is limited. Most people have never seen coins. They barter goods, chickens, or labour instead. Money exists, yes, but it flows mostly in the hands of nobles, merchants, and church officials. As you sweep through the narrow lanes, you catch snippets of overheard conversation about the future, except the future to these people means next Sunday. No one thinks in centuries. No one imagines sweeping social change. The idea of progress is more superstition than science. Yet ironically, medieval Europe is already shifting in slow, powerful currents beneath the surface. Population is starting to rise as the climate enters a warm and stable phase. Noble families are consolidating, slowly forming the backbone of future states. New technologies, heavier ploughs, improved harnesses, water mills, are creeping into rural life and boosting productivity more than anyone at the time realizes. You see a monk travelling between villages carrying a satchel of copied manuscripts. He looks exhausted, partly from walking miles in cheap sandals and partly because he's been debating theology for 2 decades straight and is starting to wonder whether anyone actually listens. He blesses a child, accepts bread from a woman kneading dough, and warns a group of boys not to carve symbols into the church door again. The church is everywhere, woven into the rhythms of life. Baptisms, harvest rituals, feast days, confessions, legal matters, and the ever-present threat that misbehaving could result in a stern lecture delivered in Latin, which would ruin anyone's week. You reach the outskirts of the town and step into the silence of the countryside once more. Roads are few, muddy and lined with ruts deep enough to swallow a goat. If you see a goat wandering alone right now, minding its own business, it's probably not lost. It's just trying to get away from the constant medieval stress. Travellers rely on footpaths, animal tracks, and the occasional half-remembered directions given by someone who said, "Just keep going straight until you see the old oak," even though there are 47 old oaks and none of them look particularly helpful. As you continue wandering, you spot a group of villagers repairing a bridge made of logs laid across a stream. They grunt and curse as a beam snaps under the weight of a man testing it. You hear him mutter something about how the Romans built better bridges 1,000 years ago. He's right, but that engineering knowledge dissolved with the empire, scattered into fragments, preserved only in a few monastic libraries. Meanwhile, a distant bell rings again, this time signalling the approach of a travelling peddler. People scramble toward him like he's a celebrity, because he brings the rarest commodity in medieval life, news. He unfurls items from distant lands, coarse cloth, tarnished metal trinkets, spices so faint in smell you suspect he stirred them with last year's leftovers. He shares rumours about conflicts between nobles, strange illnesses in far-off towns, and a king who supposedly plans to reform taxation. Everyone laughs at that last one, because taxation reform is the medieval equivalent of, "I'll start my diet on Monday." As the crowd gathers around him, you slip past and keep moving, exploring a continent that is just beginning to shape the world to come. Each step carries you through forests thick as walls, fields dotted with tiny homesteads, and towns barely rising above the surrounding mud. It all looks fragile, yet somehow it's the starting point for a millennium of transformation. Right now, though, Europe is a place of small horizons, small luxuries, and realities that demand practical survival before anything else. And as you tread deeper, you realise that to understand the next 1,000 years, you must understand this moment. Raw, uneasy, hopeful, and hanging by a thread between old empires and new worlds. You continue forward without pausing, the mud of the last village still clinging to your boots as the landscape shifts subtly. The fields stretch wider here, divided into long strips that look like someone tried to comb the earth with a fork too big for human hands. This is where the real machinery of medieval Europe hums, not in grand castles or royal courts, but in the constant grinding exchanges of obligation that define feudal life. You step into it as naturally as breathing. though one wrong move and you'll find yourself owing someone 3 days of labour and half a chicken. A shout echoes across the fields. A Lord Steward is inspecting work. He's the sort of man who walks like he owns the soil, the sky and the general concept of breathing. Technically he doesn't own any of it, his master does, but he enforces the feudal hierarchy with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoys scolding underpaid people for not hoeing fast enough. You watch him wave a wax tablet as he tallies who has completed their required corvée labour, ploughing, repairing fences and clearing brush. Feudalism isn't a metaphor here, it's a literal quantified system of obligations, one that follows the rule of you get land access, you owe service. Simple enough, except it never actually feels simple to the peasants performing it. A man beside you mutters about having to work his lord's domain fields on the same day his own crops desperately need tending. You nod sympathetically, which he takes as an invitation to explain how every year this system squeezes tighter. You listen because he deserves an audience, and also because ignoring a medieval peasant's rant is an excellent way to get dragged into helping with thatching. He points at the steward and says something that roughly translates to that man's soul is shaped like a turnip, which you assume is a grave insult by local standards. As you walk uphill toward the manor house, you pass serfs who are legally tied to the land. They're not slaves, but they're absolutely not free either. They can't move without permission, can't marry without permission, and if they inherit land, they owe a special tax for the privilege, a medieval "congratulations, you're responsible now, give us money." You watch a young couple negotiating with a minor official to approve their marriage. The official pretends to think deeply about a decision he made 5 seconds ago, a performance as old as bureaucracy itself. Beyond them, free peasants work their own strips of land, grumbling with a slightly more confident tone because they're not bound quite as tightly to the estate. Even so, they still owe rent, tithes and occasional labour. Everyone here knows where they stand on the ladder, and no one pretends the ladder is fair. You glance at one small boy who's pretending to work, but mostly using a stick to draw spirals in the dirt. His father scolds him with the energy of a man who knows childhood is a luxury. The manor itself sits on a gentle rise, half stone and half timber, smelling faintly of roast meat and wet dog. Inside, the lord of this estate holds court, not the velvet-draped, chandelier-lit courts of later centuries, but a functional hall where villagers present disputes and officials record fines. You slip in at the edge, listening as 2 neighbours argue over grazing rights. Grazing disputes, by the way, are medieval Europe's version of endless Twitter fights. Petty, dramatic, and apparently impossible to resolve. The Lord hears petitions with a practised indifference, handing out judgments that are technically lawful and emotionally disappointing for everyone involved. A villager is fined for stealing firewood from the Lord's forest, not because he stole, but because the forest technically isn't his to steal from. Another is ordered to mend a boundary ditch he knowingly ignored. The system works not because it's fair, but because it's predictable. Under feudalism, stability matters more than justice, and predictability matters most of all. Outside again, you walk along the path leading toward a cluster of small houses shaped like upturned baskets. Smoke leaks from holes in the roofs, carrying scents of barley soup, wet wool, and something that might be cabbage but might also be despair. You duck inside one hut, careful not to hit your head. A family sits around the hearth, eating a meal that looks less like stew and more like hot, edible water with aspirations. They greet you warmly because hospitality is a moral duty, and also because if you turn out to have news, you're automatically the most interesting person they've met this month. As they talk, you learn how feudal Jews rhythmically structure their lives. 3 days of forced labour per week during planting season, various small payments in kind, grain, eggs, chickens, and occasional extraordinary demands during emergencies. You try to keep track of each obligation, but by the time someone says, "and then there's the plough tax," your brain quietly taps out. The system is intentionally confusing, and the people running it prefer it that way. Further down the path, you find the village reeve, an elected peasant responsible for organising labour and collecting dues on behalf of the lord. Think of him as a cross between a local mayor, a tax collector, and that one guy at work who keeps reminding you about deadlines. You observe him overseeing the distribution of ploughing teams, making sure the oxen are harnessed correctly and the strips are ploughed in the right order. Villagers joke with him, but their laughter is cautious. The reeve has power, and power in medieval Europe always has teeth. Walking away from the village, you pass a group of armed retainers practicing with spears. They serve the local lord in exchange for land, and their training is a reminder of why feudalism exists in the first place: protection, or at least the promise of it. Bandits roam the forests, rival lords raid borders, and larger conflicts periodically wash through the land like storms. In theory, the lord protects his people. In practice, the peasants often feel like they're paying for a service that shows up late and occasionally burns their house down. Still, the retainers take their role seriously. One of them, sweating under chainmail that looks a size too small, cracks a joke about how armour never smells good, even when it's new. He's right. You stand downwind for 3 seconds and immediately regret having a functioning nose. Past the training ground, the land opens into a wide common pasture where villagers graze pigs among oak trees. This is the medieval equivalent of communal Wi-Fi. Everyone depends on it, everyone argues about it, and everyone pretends they're not using more than their fair share. You watch children collecting firewood while their mothers gather acorns and mushrooms. Foraging isn't a hobby here, it's survival. At the far edge of the common land, you find the boundary marker between this estate and the next. It's an old stone, worn smooth, and absolutely sacred in its significance. Moving it even an inch would trigger a feud lasting generations, the medieval version of an unstoppable family group chat argument. As you continue your journey, you realise feudalism isn't a rigid legal system carved into stone tablets. It's a living, breathing web of negotiations, duties, expectations, and mutual reliance. Lords depend on peasants as much as peasants depend on lords. Vassals balance loyalty with ambition. Everyone is trapped in a system they didn't choose, but all of them participate because without it, chaos yawns just beyond the tree line. The continent feels bigger now, not physically but socially. Every relationship, every responsibility, every field tilled, and every oath sworn weaves Europe into the world you're walking through. Feudalism shapes everything: land distribution, social status, warfare, law, family life, and even architecture. And as you step forward, the manor behind you shrinking into the landscape, you feel the full weight of the hierarchy pressing on your shoulders. You may not be a serf, but here, everyone answers to someone. You leave the manor's orbit and head toward the distant silhouette rising above the rolling fields. At first, it looks like just another mound topped with timber, but as you get closer, you see the full shape of a Motten Bailey castle, the earliest and most common fortress across medieval Europe. It's not the stone giant you probably picture. Instead, it's a wooden stronghold perched atop an artificial hill, with a small courtyard enclosed by a palisade below. Think of it as the medieval starter home for lords who haven't yet unlocked the budget for stone construction perk. A guard waves you forward, his spear leaning casually in the crook of his arm as if he's used to long hours of boredom, interrupted only by the occasional chicken wandering too close to the gate. He asks where you're heading, and you give a vague gesture in the direction of the horizon, which in medieval Europe is a perfectly acceptable travel plan. Satisfied, he lets you pass, though you notice him eyeing your shoes as if checking which tax bracket you belong to. Inside the bailey, activity buzzes like a hive. Blacksmiths hammer horseshoes, sparks flying. Carpenters shape beams, mending sections of the palisade that look suspiciously like they were rammed by something large and angry, probably during the last minor feud with a neighbouring lord. You walk by women stirring bubbling pots of animal fat and ashes, making soap in quantities that would horrify modern dermatologists but delight anyone who's been living in the same tunic for 3 weeks. Off to the side, a pair of young pages practice with wooden swords. One swings too hard, misses, and whacks a barrel instead. The sound echoes across the courtyard, and his friend laughs with the kind of glee only possible when you're hitting things without consequences. A nearby knight corrects their stances, adjusting elbows and muttering encouragement or warnings you can't quite hear. Pages aspire to become squires, and squires aspire to become knights, which means years of training, bruises, chores, and carrying around armour that weighs about as much as existential dread. Speaking of armour, you see a squire oiling his knight's chainmail, revealing how incredibly time-consuming it is to maintain metal links that rust at the mere mention of humidity. The knight, a man with a beard that could legally qualify as its own defensive weapon, tests the balance of his sword with a mixture of pride and resignation. You can tell he likes the idea of being a knight, but perhaps not the endless training, the heavy gear, or the fact that he will soon have to defend this castle whether he wants to or not. You follow him toward the motte, climbing the steep wooden stairs that lead to the stronger tower above. From the top you look out over the landscape, endless fields, scattered forests and thin roads that look peaceful until you imagine dozens of angry men sprinting up them with torches and questionable dental hygiene. This tower acts as both defence and symbol, a reminder to everyone within sight that authority lives here. But castles aren't just symbols, they're functional machines of war. You descend back into the bailey and walk to the small training yard, where armed retainers prepare for the kind of violence that makes medieval childhood stories weirdly intense. A weapons master demonstrates the arc of a long sword, explaining its reach and weight. A group of soldiers practice forming a shield wall, locking their wooden shields together in a pattern that looks almost choreographed. You slip behind them and watch how the formation tightens, each man stepping in rhythm, each shield overlapping with the next, a human puzzle designed to keep arrows from turning bodies into unpleasant pincushions. One soldier jokes about how the last time this formation was used for real, someone sneezed and broke the rhythm, causing the entire line to ripple like a badly coordinated dance troupe. You decide not to ask whether he's exaggerating. Medieval humour doesn't always match modern expectations, and you'd prefer not to discover which part of that story involved actual danger. A loud horn suddenly echoes from atop the palisade. A drill, not an attack. But the energy shifts instantly. Guards hustle to their posts. Archers take positions along the walkway. Children are ushered indoors. You feel the tension coil through the air as you climb the ladder to join the sentries. From up here the world feels smaller but sharper, every movement across the fields potentially meaningful. The guard beside you tells you they practice twice a week, because no one wants to be the idiot who forgets what a horn call means when real raiders appear on the horizon. Even though this is a drill, you glimpse the seriousness behind it. Rival lords raid each other's lands for livestock, supplies, or just to demonstrate dominance. Bands of mercenaries roam between wars, and not all of them behave as politely as their employers pretend. Even weather can spark conflict. A drought leads to hunger, hunger leads to desperation, and desperation leads to raiding. Castles aren't just dramatic backdrops. They are shelters, command centres, and lifelines. When the drill ends, life resumes. The tension fades as fast as it came, replaced by the steady thud of work. You observe a carpenter reinforcing the hinges on the heavy wooden gate, explaining how this spot is the weakest point in the entire defensive structure. Attackers know it too. During a siege, this gate becomes a battlefield all its own. Fire, battering rams, desperate defenders, desperate attackers. The hinge pins experience more trauma than most medieval therapists could handle. You continue across the bailey toward a stone structure under construction. This, the mason tells you, will become a proper stone keep one day. As kings grow stronger and local warfare evolves, wooden forts eventually lose their edge. Stone dominates the later centuries, transforming castles into monumental symbols of wealth and authority. It's expensive, yes, but nothing says, "Stay away, please, and thank you," quite like walls, so thick you could host a dinner party inside them. He shows you the blocks his team is shaping, each cut by hand, each fitted with a precision that seems almost impossible with the tools available. The process is slow, noisy, and astonishingly physical. You help lift one stone. Or rather, you try, fail, and immediately pretend you weren't trying. The mason laughs and pats your shoulder. "Not everyone's built for walls," he says, which might be the nicest medieval way of calling someone weak. Leaving the future keep behind, you journey out of the bailey through a side gate and follow a track leading toward a more advanced fortress some miles away. This one is stone from the start, perched atop a rocky outcrop. As you approach, you feel dwarfed by its presence. Thick curtain walls encircle inner courtyards. Arrow slits peer outward like suspicious eyes. A deep ditch surrounds the base, making you very aware that falling into it is a terrible idea. Inside, you witness a very different military mood. Here, archers practice shooting at straw targets painted with crude faces. Their bows are powerful enough to punch through armour at range, though one man complains loudly about how his string broke last week and nearly took out his eyebrow. You make a mental note not to stand anywhere near moving bowstrings, ever. Further in, siege engineers prepare a counterweight trebuchet for demonstration. This massive machine dominates the central yard, and you stare at it the way someone from the 21st century might stare at a rocket launch pad. A man explains the mechanics. The counterweight drops, the arm swings, the sling releases, and the resulting projectile turns enemy fortifications into very confused piles of stone. You nod wisely, pretending you understand the physics, while secretly admiring the fact that medieval people invented a device that basically weaponizes gravity out of pure frustration. The demonstration begins. You stand back as workers load a large stone into the sling, latch the arm and step away. A final command is shouted. The arm drops, the machine groans to life, and the stone arcs through the sky like a vengeful pigeon. It hits the distant field with a heavy thud, and you imagine walls crumbling, defenders scattering, and someone loudly regretting their life choices. Warfare, you realise, isn't just about swords and armour. It's precision, engineering, logistics, and a healthy acceptance of chaos. Moving along the battlements, you find soldiers preparing hot sand, pitch, and rocks. All standard tools for repelling attackers. Medieval warfare is creative in ways you don't necessarily appreciate while standing directly behind the people preparing boiling liquids. One guard casually mentions that dropping beehives on attackers used to be a thing. You tell him you believe him, though internally you have follow-up questions about how many bees willingly enlisted. The castle's Great Hall offers a quieter perspective. Here, strategy is planned. Maps, really just rough sketches of land features, are spread across a heavy wooden table. The lord and his captains discuss alliances, territorial disputes, and the delicate math of deciding whether they can afford to feed their army during a prolonged conflict. It's clear that warfare isn't a heroic charge across fields. It's negotiation, supply chains, training, morale, and the constant weighing of risk. Yet even with all this seriousness, life persists around the war machine. In the courtyard, cooks prepare stew for the garrison. Children chase a dog near the stables. A washerwoman glares at a soldier for dropping muddy clothes where she just finished hanging clean linens, proving that some medieval conflicts are eternal and universal. As you step through the postern gate and leave the fortress behind, you carry with you the full weight of how warfare shapes medieval Europe. Castles dominate the landscape not because they're pretty, but because they're necessary. Power is defended as much as it is claimed, and every stone laid, every arrow fired, every horn blown becomes part of the continent's shifting tapestry of defence and ambition. You walk onward, ready to step from battle-ready fortresses into the humbler, harsher rhythms of peasant survival. Because while lords fight their wars, the people in the fields keep the entire world alive. You step away from the looming stone walls and follow the winding dirt road that slopes gently downward into the patchwork of fields. The air smells different here. Less of smoke and iron, more of earth, animals, and whatever is bubbling inside the nearest cooking pot. This is where the real foundation of medieval Europe lives and breathes. Not in the castles, not in the courts. Here, in the fields and cottages, where peasants grind out survival with hands chapped by cold and workdays longer than an influencer apology video. A rooster crows somewhere ahead, loudly enough that you suspect it believes it runs the entire universe. You pass into a village just as the first rays of sunlight slip across the thatched roofs. Dog barks, chickens scatter, and someone yells at a pig that is attempting an early morning jailbreak. Your boots sink into a mixture of mud, straw, and substances best left undescribed. It's the universal medieval flooring solution. Rustic, aromatic, and guaranteed to add texture to your day. A woman hauling water from a well glances at you and gives a polite nod. Nothing too enthusiastic, because strangers are either interesting, dangerous, or about to ask for bread. She hefts the wooden bucket, muscles straining, and carries it toward a cottage where the fire already crackles. Inside, a family is waking up. You hear a child whining about how early it is, and a mother responding with the medieval equivalent of "get up or else," which somehow sounds even scarier when spoken while stirring oats with a stick the size of a toddler's leg. You duck into the open doorway as the family gestures you in, assuming you're a harmless traveller, or at least someone too tired looking to commit crimes. Their house is a single room shared with goats, chickens, tools, and an impressive variety of smells. Light streams through the smoke hole, catching dust motes in a golden beam that looks beautiful until one of the goats sneezes directly into it. The father sits by the hearth, sharpening a wooden implement while drinking ale. Breakfast ale, mind you, because water is suspicious and ale is liquid safety. He offers you a sip. It tastes like someone whispered the idea of beer into a puddle. The family prepares for the day. The eldest daughter kneads dough made from coarse grain, enough to bake a handful of flat, heavy loaves that double as both food and potential blunt force weapons. The younger children tie bundles of sticks for kindling. The mother cracks a joke about how the rooster is louder than the priest, and everyone laughs, though quietly. Gossip travels faster than carts around here. Stepping back outside, you watch the village come alive. Cottages sit clustered around a central green, though green is generous. It's more brown than green, but everyone pretends not to notice. A few houses lean at angles that defy basic architectural principles. Smoke rises from hearths, carrying scents of porridge, onions, and the faint tang of last night's stew, reheated into something that might legally qualify as a new species. Peasants head to the open fields beyond the village, each one responsible for narrow strips scattered across the landscape. This strip system forces everyone to depend on each other, whether they like each other or not. You walk alongside a plough team of 2 oxen and 3 humans. One man guides the plough, another encourages the oxen with commands that seem to be half words, half threats, and half desperate pleas. Medieval math allows 3 halves. It's fine. The soil turns reluctantly. Each clump of earth looks like it's considering staying put forever, but the villagers push through, knowing these furrows represent life or death. You watch them work for hours with a rhythm that's almost hypnotic, so lean, push, step, strain. Sweat glistens across foreheads. They pause only when a boy appears with a jug of ale, which is passed around like holy water. The boy then runs off to help his mother gather firewood, doing more chores before noon than some modern adults do before tax season. You move on to the next group of labourers. Women bent over rows of vegetables, pulling weeds with practised hands. Their conversations flow easily despite the physical work. Someone complains about a husband who forgets to help with laundry. Someone else jokes that the new priest snores during his own sermons. You sense a camaraderie that spans age, gender, and household boundaries. The survival kind, built not on choice but on necessity. Up ahead, several villagers repair a fence. It's a collaborative project, partly because wood is expensive and partly because gossip is free. One man uses an axe to sharpen stakes, while another digs new holes with a tool that looks like it's been handed down since the last millennium. A third man holds the fence steady while providing commentary that adds nothing useful to the process. You stand nearby pretending to help while mostly staying out of the way, because getting roped into just holding this for a second could lead to an unpaid internship lasting 3 hours. A shepherd passes by, guiding a flock of sheep with a dog that clearly runs the operation. The shepherd waves, then uses his staff to redirect a rebellious lamb that keeps wandering toward a ditch. You ask him how long he's been doing this. He shrugs. Always. He talks about wolves, weather, and the fact that sheep stink no matter how much you love them. As you watch the flock shuffle along, you're struck by how essential animals are to medieval life. Transportation, food, wool, and occasionally therapy, if the dog lets you pet it. Approaching the riverbank, you find a group of women pounding laundry against stones, while chatting at a volume that suggests the entire village can hear them. Laundry day is less a chore and more an information exchange. Someone mentions a broken betrothal. Someone else hints at a neighbour's bad harvest. You try not to look too curious, but one of the women catches your expression and gives you a knowing smirk. Medieval gossip networks move at the speed of light. A fisherman nearby pulls in a net with a handful of tired-looking fish. He explains that the river used to offer more, but seasons fluctuate, and overfishing is a concept no one has invented yet. He hands you a small fish, telling you it's lucky, though from the smell you suspect the fish disagrees. As midday arrives, the field's quiet. Tools are set aside. Workers gather under a large oak tree for their meal. Bread, cheese, ale, maybe some onions, and the occasional bit of dried meat. They gesture for you to join, which you do, because refusing would be rude, and also because you're starving. You share bread that could double as masonry material. And someone cracks a joke about how the bread feels stronger than the fences. Laughter ripples through the group, warm and honest. The conversation shifts to fears, famine, sickness, storms, taxes. They talk about last winter's hardship when a frost killed half the barley, forcing families to stretch their stores thin. You hear about a neighbour who starved 2 villages over. Their voices lower when they mention him, as if acknowledging tragedy might invite it back. You sense the weight of uncertainty everywhere. Survival depends not just on hard work but on luck, and luck is in short supply. After the meal, work resumes. You follow a pair of teenagers assigned to gather manure for composting. They complain dramatically the entire time, which feels oddly modern. You watch them fling shovelfuls of muck into a pile, while arguing about which saint is most likely to help with the weather. You decide this is not the moment to ask theological questions. Near the edge of the village, you find a small communal garden where herbs grow. Parsley, sage, mint, and medicinal plants like yarrow and comfrey. An elderly woman tends it with reverence, explaining the uses of each leaf and flower. She tells you which plants ease fevers, which soothe stomach pain, and which help wounds heal. She's not a witch. She's just keeping everyone alive. You notice the care in her movements, and the quiet pride in her voice, and you realise she's as essential as the ploughman or the shepherd. By late afternoon, the sun dips low and shadows stretch across the fields. Villagers begin returning to their cottages, weary but purposeful. Inside one home you watch as dinner is prepared, a stew simmering over the fire, thickening slowly as barley absorbs the liquid. The family eats together, sharing stories from the day. A child falls asleep before finishing his bowl. A father scratches his beard and stares into the fire, thinking about tomorrow's chores. A mother mends clothing with tiny, careful stitches. Outside, night brings new sounds. Crickets. Wind rustling through thatched roofs. A distant howl. Hopefully a dog. Possibly a wolf. Doors are barred. Fires banked. Families huddle together for warmth, sharing blankets sewn from patched scraps of wool. You lie near the hearth, the heat fading slowly, the smoke curling above you like a drifting dream. And as you drift with it, you understand the relentless cycle of rural medieval life. Wake, work, eat, pray, rest, repeat. It's exhausting. It's precarious. It's communal. It's the heartbeat of Europe. And though the peasants don't know they're shaping history, each seed planted, each field ploughed, each child curled against a parent's side helps build the world you'll step into next. The scent of wood smoke fades behind you as you leave the fields and follow a rutted track toward a cluster of buildings that rises from the horizon like a promise, or at least like a place that sells slightly better food than yesterday's stew. Towns in medieval Europe are still small by modern standards, but they hum with an energy utterly different from the quiet rhythm of rural life. As you approach, the first thing you notice is noise. Carts rumbling, animals braying, people shouting prices, greetings and arguments in equal measure. A wooden sign swings above the gate, creaking in the breeze. The town's walls aren't grand stone battlements yet. Instead, they're timber palisades reinforced with earth, supported by stakes that lean like they've been through one too many storms. But even so, the walls matter. They mark the boundary between countryside and commerce, danger and safety, farm rhythms and market chaos. You join a small crowd waiting to pass through the gate, where a guard collects tolls with the blank expression of someone who has stopped caring about humanity's ability to complain. A merchant in front of you argues the fee is too high. The guard neither moves nor blinks. The merchant sighs heavily, pays, and mutters something about how everything was cheaper last year, which is probably what he says every year. Once inside, the world tightens. Streets twist like tangled shoelaces, hemmed in by timber buildings whose upper floors jut precariously over the path. You swear some of them lean so far they're practically gossiping with each other. Laundry hangs between windows, fluttering in the breeze like banners announcing household chaos. A couple of chickens run beneath your feet, chased by a child who seems determined to catch them through sheer enthusiasm alone. You make your way toward the central market square, the beating heart of the town. The moment you step into it, your senses are overwhelmed. Stalls spill outward in crooked rows, each one crowded with goods: coarse cloth, pots, rope, candles, dried fish, wooden bowls, iron tools, leather shoes, and spices so faint and expensive they're protected like royal treasure. Merchants shout over each other to lure customers. Some use flattery, some use threats. Some use discounts that are absolutely not discounts, but sound convincing if you squint. A fishmonger slaps a carp onto his stall with theatrical flair, splashing water onto everyone within a 10-foot radius. A cooper displays barrels of various sizes, pounding a new one into shape with rhythmic thuds. A woman selling herbs waves a bundle of fragrant rosemary under your nose, insisting it cures headaches, stomach aches, curses, and inconvenient relatives. You buy a sprig because honestly she's very persuasive. Moving deeper into the market, you encounter guild banners, bright cloth symbols fluttering like miniature flags. Guilds run almost all skilled trades in towns: blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, masons, bakers, coopers, shoemakers, and fullers who treat cloth in vats that smell strong enough to qualify as chemical warfare. Each guild member wears a small badge indicating their status: apprentice, journeyman, or master. Apprentices look exhausted. Journeymen look hopeful. Masters look like people who finally get to set the rules. You slip into a weaver's workshop. The rhythmic clack of the loom fills your ears as a woman works with quick, practiced motions, pulling threads into patterns she barely needs to look at. She explains her guild requires strict standards, quality checks, price controls, and limits on when and where she can sell her cloth. It sounds restrictive, but guilds also guarantee training, protect trade secrets, and support members when illness or injury strikes. In a world without social safety nets, a guild is as close as you get to one. Back on the street, you follow the smell of bread, warm, yeasty, and blessedly free of goat influence. It leads you to the town bakery, where an apprentice pulls loaves from a stone oven. The heat blasts your face as he opens the door, and he grins with the pride of a young man whose bread has not burned today, which is cause for celebration. He sells you a loaf fresh enough to steam in your hands. It tastes far better than the rock-hard rural bread you ate yesterday, but you wisely avoid saying so aloud. Insulting someone's barley loaf is how medieval feuds begin. From the bakery, you wander toward the crafts quarter. Here, the air fills with hammering, sawing, grinding, and the unmistakable odour of tanning hides. You spot a tanner stirring a vat of something that should never, ever be stirred outside of a biohazard facility. He waves at you cheerfully, blissfully unaware of how his job assaults the nostrils of all living beings within 3 town blocks. You wave back politely, then immediately pretend to admire something in the opposite direction. A short walk away, the shoemakers work in quieter concentration. One crafts a pair of leather boots, tapping nails into the sole with delicate precision. When you ask how long a pair lasts, he shrugs. Depends on whether the owner walks like a normal person or like someone stomping away from every argument. You do not take the comment personally. As the sun climbs, the market grows even busier. Travellers arrive from neighbouring villages with carts full of grain, eggs or wool, hoping to trade for tools, salt and rare goods. A peddler from far away displays glass beads and a tiny bronze figurine, claiming it came from beyond the seas, though he's vague about which seas. A spice merchant sells pepper at a price that could bankrupt a small hamlet. You watch as a wealthy townsman buys a pinch, then walks away triumphantly as if he has just acquired the crown jewels. Not everything here is commerce. The town is a crossroads of ideas, rumours, news, and cultural habits. A storyteller stands near the well, spinning tales of foreign lands and local scandals with equal enthusiasm. A couple of musicians tune their instruments, a fiddle and a small drum, preparing for evening performance. A group of teenagers loiter near an alley, trying to look mysterious and rebellious while mostly tripping over their own cloaks. You step into a tavern where travellers rest. Inside, the air is warm, thick with smoke and laughter. People from different villages and occasionally different countries share stories. A merchant boasts about a caravan he joined last year. A sailor talks about storms that nearly shattered his ship. A woman from a town across the river complains about her lord's taxes with the passion of someone who has run out of patience and excuses. The tavern keeper brings you a wooden cup of ale and a bowl of stew. You take a bite and recognise at least 2 ingredients, which is impressive by medieval standards. A man beside you asks where you're from, and you answer vaguely to avoid triggering a half-hour interrogation about your regional dialect. He nods knowingly, then spends 20 minutes telling you everything wrong with his local guild's current leadership. Stepping back into the sunlight, you follow a side street that leads you to the river where merchants load goods onto boats headed toward larger cities downstream. You watch as crates of wool, timber, iron tools and salted fish are stacked carefully onto barges. This waterway is part of a vast network connecting distant regions, the veins and arteries of medieval trade. A boatman shouts at his crew to stop arguing and push off before the tide shifts. They obey reluctantly, and the boat glides into the current. Watching it drift away, you sense how movement of goods, people and ideas transforms medieval Europe. Towns grow because they connect. Roads, rivers, markets, guilds. Every trade route widens horizons. Even as towns bustle, though, they're not immune to problems. You overhear a group of citizens discussing a recent fire. Timber buildings catch quickly, and a single spark can destroy an entire neighbourhood. Disease spreads fast, too. A single sick traveller could infect dozens. And sanitation. Well, let's just say the drainage channels running down the middle of the street are doing their best with very little help. Yet despite these dangers, towns represent freedom. Peasants sometimes run away to settle in them. Merchants grow rich. Artisans become respected masters. Families rise from poverty to stability, or at least to a life with fewer goats sharing the living space. As evening falls, the market winds down. Stalls close. Merchants pack their goods. Children chase each other between crates. Lamps flicker to life. The town hums at a softer pitch now, like a great beast settling into sleep. You pause at the gate, looking back at the maze of streets, the colours, the smells, the noise fading behind you. Town life isn't easy, but compared to the fields, it's a different world, faster, louder, more unpredictable, more interconnected. And from these cramped streets will eventually rise the foundations of Europe's commercial revolution, urban culture, and the early sparks of capitalism. You step back onto the road, carrying the market's energy with you as you head toward the towering force that shapes every corner of medieval life, the church. You leave the flickering lamplight of the town behind and walk into the cool evening air, following the sound of a distant bell that tolls with slow, deliberate weight. It echoes across fields and riverbanks, across roads worn smooth by traders' carts, across cottages settling into twilight. No matter where you travel in medieval Europe, that bell is never far. The church stretches everywhere, to markets, harvests, marriages, funerals, taxes, politics, dreams and fears, a presence so vast that even the quiet rustling of wind through trees seems to carry a hint of its voice. As dawn breaks the next morning, you approach a stone church perched on a slight rise above a small village. It's nothing extravagant: rough masonry, narrow windows, a roof patched in places with wooden shingles. But to the villagers below, this is the axis of the universe. You step inside just as the priest finishes lighting candles for morning prayer, the scent of beeswax mingling with damp stone and incense. The air feels thick with anticipation, or maybe that's just your lungs struggling with the medieval incense-to-oxygen ratio. The priest gives you a nod, assuming you're a weary traveller seeking a moment of shelter. He speaks softly, with that measured cadence all priests seem trained in. He tells you he rose hours ago to chant the morning office, part of a sequence of daily prayers that shape the monastic and clerical routine. You glance at his worn hands, the ink stains on his fingers, the fatigue buried in his eyes. Priests aren't wealthy here. They're overworked, under-rested, and expected to solve every crisis from marital disputes to cow-related miracles. You sit on a creaky bench as villagers begin filing in. An elderly woman crosses herself 3 times just to be safe. A man removes his cap reverently. A child fidgets until his mother whispers something stern into his ear, and he immediately freezes like a statue. The priest begins the service, speaking Latin that few present understand. But understanding isn't the point. Presence is. Ritual is. This is where births are blessed, sins confessed, bodies buried, marriages sanctioned, disputes settled, and souls shaped. After the service, the priest steps outside to greet the community. He listens to complaints, offers advice, and accepts a hen as partial payment for officiating a baptism last week. You watch him juggle pastoral care with the political finesse of someone who knows every word he speaks will ripple through the village for months. A man pulls him aside to complain about his brother stealing firewood. A woman requests prayers for her sick cow. A teenager begs him not to tell anyone about a broken window that may or may not have been caused by a slingshot mishap. The priest handles each crisis with the serenity of a man who long ago accepted that medieval life is 90% problem-solving and 10% sacred ceremony. You follow the priest to his modest home beside the church. Inside, manuscripts lie open on a simple table. Some are sermon notes, others letters from the bishop, demanding updates on tithes, attendance, and whether the priest is keeping the village properly in line. You flip through a book of saints' lives, admiring the elaborate initials and the faint smell of parchment. Before you can ask questions, the priest excuses himself. He must prepare for a funeral later today. In medieval Europe, funeral preparation is unfortunately a standing appointment. You leave him to his work and make your way toward a nearby monastery, whose stone silhouette rises in the distance like a fortress of silence. The path leads you through rolling hills and fields dotted with sheep. By the time you reach the monastery gate, the sun is high, and the air vibrates with chanting. A monk opens the wooden door, his eyes calm behind a face prematurely aged by long hours and limited sleep. He gestures for you to enter quietly. Inside the cloister, monks move in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Some tend to the garden, cultivating herbs essential for healing. Others mend robes or copy manuscripts so beautifully detailed they look like works of divine patience. You stand in the scriptorium watching a monk dip his quill into ink, forming letters so precise each stroke feels like a prayer. His workspace is dim, illuminated by a narrow window. You whisper a question about how long it takes to copy a single manuscript. He looks up with a gentle smile and says, "Months, sometimes years," before returning to work as if he didn't just reveal the patience level of a saint. A young novice beside him struggles to keep his lines straight, muttering under his breath. His instructor taps his shoulder, reminding him that uneven margins are a sin against both aesthetics and saintly discipline. You pretend not to hear the novice's quiet grumbling. Even in a monastery, petty frustrations thrive. Walking further, you arrive at the monastery kitchen where a monk stirs a pot of pottage with the resigned air of someone who has eaten pottage every day for 30 years. He cracks a joke that the secret ingredient is hope, though the smell suggests the second secret ingredient might be cabbage. You help chop onions for a moment, and he thanks you with unexpected warmth, perhaps because chopping onions is the medieval equivalent of penance. In the refectory, monks sit in silence while one reads aloud from a theological text. You join them, listening as philosophical arguments echo off stone walls. Even though the reading is complex, you sense the comfort in their routine, the way discipline structures their days. Meals, prayer, work, study, more prayer, slightly more work, a quick nap if you're very lucky. A bell rings, and the monks rise for the next prayer cycle. You step aside as they move in a slow procession to the chapel. The chanting resumes, each voice joining a collective harmony that fills the vaulted space. You feel the vibrations in your chest, a hum that seems to anchor the monastery to the earth. Whatever you believe, or don't, you can't deny the power in the unity of their voices. After the service, you walk with an older monk who gladly shares stories about the monastery's past. He talks about how monastic communities preserve knowledge, maintain trade networks, create artistic manuscripts, and offer refuge to travellers. He mentions with pride that their herbal garden supplies remedies to villages miles away. He also mentions, with less pride, that Brother Thomas keeps falling asleep during matins, but insists he's simply resting his eyelids in God's presence. Leaving the monastery, you travel toward a larger town, where the church's presence grows even more complex. Here, the cathedral dominates the skyline, towering, intricate, ambitious. Stone masons chip away at new sections, climbing scaffolding that makes you instinctively step back. Inside, stained glass windows filter sunlight into kaleidoscopic patterns that dance across the floor. Priests in embroidered vestments oversee ceremonies, and choirs echo hymns that seem to vibrate the very air. Bishops wield authority not just over spiritual life, but political life too. Land ownership, taxation rights, legal disputes, and alliances flow through their offices. You watch a bishop hold court over a land argument between two noblemen. He listens, weighs testimonies, then delivers a ruling that satisfies no one and yet ends the feud, at least temporarily. Power, you realise, is a balancing act, and clerical robes don't soften its edges. You sit in on a meeting where clerks record tithe receipts. Farmers bring grain, wool, and coin to fulfil their obligations, each offering carefully measured. One man tries to argue that his goat should count as double, because it is unusually wise. The clerk disagrees. The goat bleats indignantly. You decide not to get involved. As the sun sets, a group of friars enters the town square preaching to the gathered crowd. Unlike monks, these men move through towns and cities bringing the church's message directly to the people. They speak of charity, humility, and mercy. Their robes are simple, their feet are dusty. Children gather around them. A woman wipes tears during the sermon. A man offers bread. Humanity, cracked and tender, pulses beneath their words. You walk with one friar as he visits the sick. He carries herbs, holy water, and a calm presence that seems to soothe the room. Some he can help, some he cannot, but he never hesitates. Back outside, he admits there are days he feels overwhelmed, then laughs and says that's probably why God invented sleep. Throughout your journey, you realise how deeply religion permeates medieval life. Feast days dictate the calendar, priests shape moral expectations, monasteries anchor learning, cathedrals define cities, bishops influence kings. Faith isn't a category of life, it is life's framework, spoken, sung, carved, painted, lived. As night deepens, you lie beneath the shadow of a cathedral tower. Bells chime the late hour. Their tones settle over you like layers of memory, the day's encounters blending into a tapestry of voices, chanting monks, scolding priests, debating bishops, laughing novices, wandering friars, praying villagers. And as the echoes fade, you understand that medieval Europe isn't held together by stone walls or armed knights. It's held together by belief, ritual, and the constant search for meaning in a world full of hardship and wonder. You wake beneath the soft tolling of a distant bell, stretch the stiffness from your limbs, and continue your journey toward a place where the air feels heavier. Not with incense this time, but with authority. The church may cradle medieval Europe, but kings, queens, and nobles attempt to steer it, shaping the continent with a mixture of ambition, improvisation, and the political equivalent of duct tape. As you follow a well-trodden road lined with hedges and muddy cart grooves, you notice how every traveller seems to be heading somewhere important, with something important to say about someone important who did something very stupid. That, you soon learn, is the fuel of medieval royal authority. Gossip, grudges, and the constant reinforcement that someone somewhere outranks someone else. The first sign you're entering the orbit of power is the road widening, not by much, but enough that two carts can awkwardly pass each other instead of reenacting a slow-motion jousting match. Soon, you approach a wooden building where royal officials collect tolls. A scribe scratches names into a ledger so worn the corners curl like old bread. He asks where you came from, where you're going, and whether you carry goods worth taxing. You answer evasively. He narrows his eyes. You narrow yours back. Eventually he gives up, stamps your passage with a wax seal, and mutters something about how travellers always make his job harder. Beyond the toll house, signs of royal presence multiply. A patrol of mounted men rides past, their horses glossy and well-fed, a sure sign they belong to someone with resources. Their leader nods at you, giving the impression of polite awareness mixed with mild suspicion, which is medieval shorthand for don't do anything weird. One rider adjusts his chainmail, making it jingle like an irritated bag of coins. Another complains loudly about saddle sores. The third reminds him that at least he isn't a foot soldier. Medieval optimism is relative. Eventually the trees part and reveal a royal residence rising ahead. Not quite a palace, not quite a fortress, but a hybrid that speaks the language of power fluently. Stone walls encircle a sprawling complex of halls, towers, and gatehouses. Flags whip in the wind, bearing the heraldic symbols of the ruling dynasty: lions, eagles, lilies, crosses, depending on which kingdom you've wandered into. The banners flutter proudly, reminding everyone that authority has branding. At the gate, guards stop you, inspecting your shoes, your cloak, and your general vibe. Satisfied you're not a threat, or at least not a very interesting one, they let you inside. Immediately you are swept into a world where hierarchy becomes palpable. Servants scurry across courtyards. Officials hurry from building to building with scrolls tucked under their arms. Horses stomp restlessly in the stables. Pages sprint at the speed of, "I've been yelled at twice this morning and it's not even noon." You follow a servant into the great hall, the political heart of the kingdom. Inside, the space brims with activity. Tapestries hang from the walls, illustrating glorious victories that absolutely did not happen that way. The ceiling arches high overhead, wooden beams carved with symbols of prosperity and legitimacy. Nobles cluster in groups, wearing garments dyed in colours that scream "I have money and I'm not afraid to show it." Indigo, crimson, deep green, gold embroidery, jewels glinting wherever they can be attached. Near the far end, the king sits on an elevated dais, flanked by advisors, clerks, and guards. He carries himself with practiced authority, chin high, shoulders broad, gaze steady. But you see the underlying exhaustion, the subtle lines around his eyes, the way his fingers drum the armrest when someone drones too long. Being king is a full-time job with terrible hours, limited benefits, and constant threats of critique from nobles who haven't ruled anything more complex than a sheep herd. Court begins with petitions. A minor noble begs for tax relief after a poor harvest. A knight demands compensation for injuries sustained while hunting on royal land. Two lords present arguments about who owns a sliver of woodland that neither of them actually wants, but both refuse to relinquish out of sheer pride. The king listens, consults his advisors, and delivers judgments that are as political as they are practical. Every decision reinforces his authority, or risks undermining it. As you watch, you see how fragile royal power truly is. Kings rely on the cooperation of nobles who expect rewards. privileges and attention. They must maintain armies without bankrupting the treasury. They must balance alliances with marriages, treaties, and sometimes elaborate hostage exchanges that sound suspiciously like a medieval version of "you can visit your cousin every other weekend if both parties agree." Between petitions, a herald announces the arrival of diplomats. Representatives from another kingdom enter, wrapped in robes that broadcast wealth with the subtlety of a parade float. They bow, exchange greetings, and present gifts: rare fabrics, carved ivory, exotic spices, and a falcon that looks at everyone like it's judging their life choices. Diplomatic negotiations begin in thick, formal language, where compliments are daggers wrapped in velvet. You slip away to observe the administrative wing. Here, clerks work in cramped rooms, copying documents, recording taxes, and organising letters. Wax seals litter the tables. Ink stains everything. One clerk mutters that the king's cousin keeps sending contradictory instructions, and his job now involves deciphering handwriting that could double as battlefield camouflage. Another clerk calculates grain storage using wooden tally sticks, then promptly loses one, causing everyone to panic briefly before finding it under a stack of sheep-related receipts. From there, you move to the treasury. Guards stand outside the heavy door with the expressionless dedication of people who are ordered not to joke at work. Inside, coin chests line the room. Silver pennies, gold florins, bronze tokens. A treasurer explains how much effort it takes to keep the kingdom solvent. Taxes, fees, fines, tolls, market dues, marriage fees, inheritance duties, and whatever extra the king can squeeze from vassals when he claims he needs funds for urgent matters. Those urgent matters often involve war, building projects, or paying off debts to someone with very sharp weapons. In the armoury, weapon racks gleam faintly in the firelight. Swords, spears, shields painted with heraldry, crossbows, bows, chainmail, quilted gambesons. The quartermaster tells you that maintaining the army consumes a huge share of resources, especially now that warfare requires professional soldiers, not just levied peasants. He complains about broken spear shafts, missing arrows, and knights who treat armour like fashion accessories. You nod sympathetically, though you're not entirely sure what you're agreeing with. You walk to the training yard where soldiers practice in earnest. Archers loose arrows in near-perfect unison. Foot soldiers drill formations, clashing shields and stomping the ground. Horsemen ride in controlled patterns, their steeds snorting clouds of breath. A drill master shouts commands so loudly you're convinced he hasn't whispered once in his entire life. He corrects stances, scolds mistakes, and praises precision with rare, thunderous approval. Then, in a quieter courtyard, you find noblewomen practicing the subtler arts of royal authority. One oversees the household staff like a general commanding troops, another instructs pages in etiquette, explaining how posture, tone, and expression shape reputation as surely as a sword shapes battle. A noblewoman reads letters from distant relatives, analysing political implications with the finesse of someone who has spent her entire life navigating alliances that hinge on marriages, dowries, and whispered promises. You pass into the private chambers reserved for the royal family. Here the grandeur softens. Embroidered cushions, carved furniture, polished chests, warm tapestries. Children play with toys carved from wood, watched by attendants who keep the chaos contained. A young prince throws a ball that bounces off a tapestry and nearly hits you. His nurse apologises profusely. The prince does not. He seems very proud of his aim. As evening approaches, a feast prepares in the great hall. Servants rush back and forth carrying dishes, roasted meats, fresh bread, pottage, pies filled with sweetened fruit or savoury fillings, and flagons of ale and wine. Musicians tune lutes and harps. Minstrels rehearse stories they will perform later, tales of heroes, saints, and kings who absolutely never exaggerated their accomplishments. The feast begins with ceremony. Nobles take their seats according to rank, a process so complicated you're convinced someone needs a flowchart. The king raises a cup in greeting. Food arrives in waves. Conversation rises like the roar of the sea. Nobles gossip about rivals. Advisors debate taxes. A jester juggles apples, then drops one and blames gravity for being rude. As you eat, you watch alliances form in real time. A whispered agreement between two nobles. A shared joke between rival households. A lady passing a note to a courtier. Every gesture is a thread in the political web. Kings don't rule alone. They rule through constant negotiation. Later, in a quieter room, the king meets with his closest advisors. Candles flicker. Maps lie unrolled on a heavy table. They discuss border disputes, unruly vassals, trade opportunities, and the delicate dance of managing the church. The king leans over the table, brow furrowed, the weight of leadership turning his posture more human than regal. He asks for opinions. He debates strategies. He considers risks. This is where power truly lives, not in the feast, not in the pageantry, but in the decisions made behind closed doors by people carrying burdens no amount of gold can lighten. As you slip away, the royal residence quiets. Guards take their posts. Servants stoke fires. Nobles retire to chambers. The king remains awake longer, staring into the hearth as if trying to read the future in the embers, and you walk out into the night, realizing that royal authority isn't just crowns and commands. It's administration, diplomacy, fear, loyalty, strategy, fatigue, and endless balance. A dance between chaos and control, shaped by the hands of those who rule and those who obey. You follow the road out of the royal orbit, watching the banners fade behind you until the stone walls and pageantry shrink into memory. Ahead lies a horizon buzzing with rumours whispered in taverns, carved into pilgrim badges, and etched nervously into the margins of monastic manuscripts. A horizon that stretches not just across Europe, but far beyond it. Word travels. A call from the Pope, promises of salvation, stories of a distant land where holy sites lie in the hands of rulers who do not follow the Christian faith. Whatever your role, peasant, knight, merchant, monk, the Crusades will ripple through your life whether you intend to join them or not. The first hint of that tidal shift comes on a dusty road where a wandering preacher, barefoot and sunburned, draws a crowd of villagers. He stands atop a broken cart, arms raised, voice raw, as he declares that the Holy Land must be reclaimed, that sins may be forgiven for those who take up the cross, and that earthly burdens pale compared to eternal reward. His speech swells with urgency, conviction, and maybe just a little theatrical flair. You watch villagers exchange uneasy looks. For some, the promise of redemption is irresistible. For others, the thought of leaving home to fight in distant lands feels like leaping off a cliff with nothing but hope as a parachute. But the preacher's call isn't where it starts, at least not officially. The true spark ignites in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, where Pope Urban II declares that Christians must aid their Eastern brethren and reclaim Jerusalem. He offers spiritual rewards, absolution, glory, divine favour, and medieval Europe listens, not just knights, but peasants, artisans, nobles, criminals, and dreamers. Some crave adventure, some crave salvation, some crave land or wealth, some simply crave meaning in lives throttled by hardship. As you walk toward a larger town, you see signs everywhere. A blacksmith is overwhelmed with orders, swords, spearheads, helmets, shields. He hammers metal until sparks shower the ground like rebellious fireflies. A tanner scrapes hides to make boots durable enough for long journeys. A woman sells dried provisions to families preparing to send sons, husbands, or brothers eastward. Even those not going feel the tremors, labour shortages, price changes, shifting loyalties. At the town square, a group of knights kneels before a bishop who blesses them as they sew crosses onto their cloaks. The scene blends solemnity with a certain amount of excited fidgeting. Several knights whisper about who will lead the expedition, whether their horses are ready, and how long the journey might take. One knight admits he has never travelled more than 2 days from home. His horse looks equally concerned. You continue walking, following the route many crusaders take, heading southeast along well-trodden roads that funnel thousands of would-be warriors toward Constantinople, the glittering Byzantine capital that acts as the gateway between Europe and the Islamic world. But before you reach that city, you encounter crusaders of every imaginable sort. A group of peasants pushes handcarts filled with supplies that are absolutely insufficient for the journey ahead. They wear patched clothing and carry rudimentary weapons, clubs, farm tools, rusty knives. Their leader, a man with charismatic eyes and questionable geography skills, assures them that God will provide. You decide not to ask whether he's aware of how far the Holy Land actually is. Nearby, a noble family prepares for departure. Servants load trunks filled with armour, tents, spices, wine, and far more clothing than seems practical for a war. Their banner flutters above them, a symbol of identity, pride, and expectation. The nobleman inspects his entourage with a mixture of anxiety and determination. His wife clasps his hands tightly, whispering a final plea for caution. Their young daughter clings to his cloak until a nurse gently pulls her back. You walk on until the train begins to shift. Forests thin, roads widen. Traders appear carrying goods from faraway lands. Silk, pepper, almonds, glassware. These merchants know what crusaders rarely do. That the East is no monolith of infidels, but a mosaic of cultures, languages, beliefs, and trade networks. As you speak to one seasoned trader, he laughs softly and tells you that half of Europe's economy will change because of the Crusades, whether Europe realizes it or not. Reaching the outskirts of Constantinople, you understand why crusaders gasp when they first see it. Its walls rise in formidable layers, massive and immovable, making every fortress you've seen so far look like a child's playhouse. Its domes shimmer. Its streets pulse with life. Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Venetians, Jews, Persians, Slavs, all moving through markets brimming with goods you've never seen. Fine silks dyed in brilliant colours, spices that sing through the air, ivory carvings, glass mosaics, perfumes so strong they could convince entire villages to reconsider their hygiene routines. The Byzantine court receives Western crusaders with a combination of hospitality and "please don't touch anything valuable." An imperial official with robes finer than a tapestry escorts you through the palace, pointing out the throne room with its mechanical lions. Yes, real mechanical lions, that roar to impress visitors. Crusaders stare, whispering to each other in awe. Many expected Byzantines to be rustic cousins, not sophisticated rulers with engineering marvels. But cultural misunderstandings brew beneath the surface. Crusaders see Byzantines as overly refined, soft, even untrustworthy. Byzantines see Crusaders as uncouth, impatient, and dangerously unpredictable. You can practically hear the muttering, "These people are going to cause problems, aren't they?" Spoiler. Yes. Yes, they are. Crossing into Anatolia, you realise how profoundly unprepared many Crusaders are for the terrain, climate, and military skill of their Muslim opponents. The Seljuk Turks, seasoned riders and archers, are nothing like the enemies Crusaders faced in Europe. You witness a skirmish, dust swirling, arrows slicing through the air, horses weaving in fluid patterns that seem choreography. Crusaders charge with raw strength and heavy armour. The Turks counter with speed and precision. Both sides fight with ferocity, driven by belief, allegiance, and the fierce pull of survival. You move on, walking through settlements where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities coexist with a complexity that Crusader propaganda conveniently ignores. In one town you see a marketplace where Arabic calligraphy decorates shop signs, where scholars debate medicine and astronomy, where spice merchants haggle with sailors, where craftsmen shape metal into tools of extraordinary finesse. A Muslim physician tells you about medical texts far more advanced than anything in European monasteries. He's polite, curious, and entirely uninterested in religious conflict. A reminder that war is rarely the whole story. In the Holy Land itself, the heat hits like a solid wall. Crusader encampments sprawl across dusty plains. Knights and foot soldiers and priests and camp followers build makeshift settlements. Life here is harsh. Supply shortages, disease outbreaks, exhaustion, and the constant tension of battle. You watch as a young crusader sharpens his sword with trembling hands, whispering a prayer. Another sits nearby staring at the horizon as if trying to understand how his life carried him so far from the fields he once ploughed. Sieges define the Crusader experience. You approach a fortified city under attack. Engines hurl stones. Archers fire from battlements. Crusaders scale ladders under a rain of arrows. The air stings with smoke and dust. You feel the adrenaline ripple through the ranks, a cocktail of fear, zeal, desperation and hope. And when walls fall, brutality follows. The First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem in 1099 unleashes violence so horrific it reverberates for centuries. You don't linger long. The details, even softened for bedtime storytelling, cling like smoke. Yet the Crusades are not a single event, but a series of waves. The call, the journey, the war, the aftermath, the trade, the diplomacy, the cultural exchange, the unintended consequences. Some Crusaders settle in newly formed states. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli. They build castles, blend cultures, adopt local customs, and sometimes fight alongside Muslim allies against rival Christian factions. History, it turns out, has a sense of irony sharper than any sword. Returning to Europe, you see how the Crusades reshape everything. Trade accelerates, exotic goods flood markets, maps expand. Knowledge travels, naval powers like Venice and Genoa grow rich, nobles return with stories that electrify Europe. Some come home poorer, many do not come home at all. Walking through a bustling port city, you see Italian merchants unloading silks, spices, citrus fruits, glassware and metalwork. These goods transform European tastes and expectations. Pepper becomes a status symbol, silk becomes a luxury currency, medicine evolves, mathematics spreads, architecture absorbs Eastern design, and cultural imagination shifts. Even those who never left Europe feel the ripple. Taxes rise to fund expeditions, laws change, kings gain leverage, the church expands its political reach, families fracture under the weight of absence, loss, or new wealth, and yet, amid all the chaos, something remarkable emerges. The first faint threads of a truly connected world. As you leave the port, the sun lowers over the horizon, golden light reflecting across the water like an unrolled path into the unknown. You follow the shimmering trail back inland, ready to confront the next great force that will reshape the continent. Not war, not faith, but something far more indifferent and far more devastating. Something that travels silently. Something that makes castles and kingdoms tremble. Something carried on a single breath. You leave the salt-stung air of the port behind and step inland, following a dirt road that winds through busy towns and quiet hamlets alike. You expect the world to feel energized after centuries of crusading, fueled by new goods, ideas, and ambitions. But instead you notice something else lurking at the margins. Whispers, unease, a tension so thin it's barely perceptible, like the pause before a storm. People speak of strange illnesses in distant lands, caravans travel lighter, merchants keep nervous distance, priests preach more urgently, and every so often, a traveller riding hard through the countryside refuses to stop and share news, as if silence might save him. You've stepped into the century when death travels faster than armies, cares nothing for borders, and rewrites Europe's story in ink as black as the disease itself. But the plague doesn't arrive all at once. Before the Black Death, hunger tests Europe first. In the early 1300s, weather patterns shift with a quiet cruelty. Summers turn wet, springs turn unpredictable. Winters drag on like sullen children refusing to go to bed. Crops rot in the fields. Hay spoils before it can feed livestock. Rivers swell and drown farmland. Grain stores dwindle. And by 1315 famine sweeps across the continent like a shadow no one invited. Walking into a village during these years feels different from the lively communities you saw earlier. People move slower, shoulders hunched, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Bread loaves shrink. Ale grows thin. Farmers stare at the sky as if bargaining directly with the clouds. You see a woman counting beans in her pot. Slowly, methodically, as though each one holds the weight of a prayer. Children gather nettles, weeds, anything vaguely edible. Men forage for acorns which must be soaked and pounded to reduce bitterness, yet still taste like damp regret. Livestock grow gaunt. Bones show through hides, and in the worst places people dig shallow pits because they know they'll soon need them. Carpenter you meet leans on his tool like it's the only thing keeping him upright. "We thought the world was ending," he says quietly, eyes glazed with memories he'd rather not revisit. Bad harvests happen, but 3 years, no one knew what to call that. By the late 1330s, Europe is recovering, slowly, unevenly, with bruises that don't show but never fully fade. Fields fill again, trade returns, people breathe easier, but while they rebuild, something stirs far away, on the other side of continents Europeans barely understand. Trade routes hum with life between China, Central Asia and the Middle East. Merchants carry silk, spices, metalwork, and something else, too small to see, too deadly to imagine. Past the Caspian Sea, past caravan routes dotted with dusty wells, past Mongol encampments and fortified cities, a silent threat begins moving west. It rides in fleas nesting in the warm fur of rats. It slips into granaries, ship holds, market stalls and monasteries. It travels faster than any rumour and doesn't need permission to enter any kingdom. You hear the first solid story in a bustling Mediterranean port. A Venetian sailor shouts at the dockmaster, waving his arms wildly as he describes an outbreak in a distant city. Boils the size of eggs, fevers that burn like fire, death within days. The dockmaster scoffs, but worry flickers across his eyes. He orders the sailors to unload goods quickly, as if speed alone might outrun disaster. You step closer to listen, but the sailor recoils. He warns you not to touch him, not even to breathe near him. His companion sits slumped nearby, coughing weakly. The crew argues whether to seek a doctor or abandon the sick man to avoid infection. Their fear is palpable. You don't stay to see their final decision. Some stories are clearer from a distance. Travelling northward, you reach a trading town where merchants gather in taverns lit by fluttering candles. They speak in hushed tones about ships refusing ports, caravans vanishing, and rumours of a black sickness that kills too fast to fight. A man from Genoa describes a siege in Crimea, where attackers supposedly hurled plague-ridden corpses over the walls. Whether the tale is true or not hardly matters. Fear spreads faster than accuracy. Then the ships arrive. You're in a coastal city the day the first sick vessel docks. The sailors seem relieved to reach land. Their faces quickly reveal they should not be relieved. Dock workers notice men aboard who barely stand. Some lie motionless. Others cling to ropes as if the deck itself is trying to swallow them. Within hours of unloading, rats scurry along the wharf, their fleas leaping eagerly to warmer bodies. That night, someone in the city develops a fever. By morning, his neck swells. By evening, he's gone. The plague has arrived. You walk through the streets days later, the city transformed. Doors are marked with chalk. Families whisper behind shuttered windows. Priests work without rest, offering last rites until their voices crack. Bells toll so frequently they lose all rhythm. A cart rolls past. There's driver calling for the dead to be brought out. A sound so chilling it wraps itself around your spine like cold fingers. The smell hits next. It lingers in alleys, clings to clothing, spreads through markets that once thrived with noise and life. People burn herbs, frankincense, anything fragrant enough to thin the air. But the smoke cannot mask the truth. You pause at a house where a woman kneels over her child, rocking, whispering prayers through sobs. A physician approaches wearing a long robe and holding a bundle of herbs. He examines the child, looks at the mother, and gently shakes his head. His eyes are hollow. You recognise the weary desperation of someone burdened with everyone's hope and no tools to fulfil it. Moving inland, you see the plague's devastation spread through villages and towns like wildfire. In one settlement, livestock wander loose because their owners can't tend them. In another, a churchyard expands so quickly the sexton stops carving full names into markers. In cities, panic breeds suspicion. People accuse outsiders, minorities, the poor, the rich, the sinful, the innocent, anyone but the fleas and rats that go unnoticed. You encounter one community where residents flee into the forest, believing open air might save them. They cling to the hope that distance equals safety. It doesn't. You meet another town where flagellants march in grim lines, whipping themselves in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. Their chants echo through narrow streets, carried on winds that don't care who suffers beneath them. But amid the devastation, humanity flickers stubbornly. A widow brings broth to a sick neighbour despite warnings. A boy holds his sister's hand as she trembles with fever. A priest who fears death every moment still walks from house to house, offering comfort. A group of women sew shrouds together, humming to keep their hands steady. Every act of kindness feels like a candle held up in a hurricane. In larger cities, the plague reshapes everything. Trade halts, guilds crumble, fields go unharvested, universities close, even royal courts shrink as nobles retreat into isolation. A king in one region flees his palace, moving from house to house in a desperate attempt to outrun the disease. Spoiler: the disease does not check royal schedules. You see the economic shockwave too. With millions dying, a third of Europe, sometimes more, labour becomes precious. Wages rise. Serfs negotiate better terms. Land lies empty, waiting for new hands. Feudal systems crack at the edges. Some lords cling to old rules. Others adapt. Entire villages vanish. New ones emerge. It is grief and opportunity. Loss and reinvention tangled together like vines. Centuries of social order begin to wobble. Survivors begin asking questions no one dared before. Why these rules? Why these taxes? Why these authorities? When death levels kings and peasants alike, the hierarchy starts feeling less inevitable. Travelling through one recovering town, you see a council meeting about rebuilding. The survivors argue, not bitterly but urgently, about how to redistribute fields abandoned by the dead. A former serf speaks boldly, no longer fearing the lord whose authority weakened with every burial. A widow claims land in her own right, and the men do not challenge her. You witness social change in real time, arising not from philosophy but from necessity. A merchant tells you he reopened his shop because people finally began buying again. They want spices, cloth, anything pretty, he says, shrugging. After so much darkness, they need colour. You nod. It makes sense. When death steals everything familiar, the living cling harder to beauty. Years pass as you walk from region to region. Waves of plague return, less shocking but still deadly. Europe adapts. Villages repopulate. New trades flourish. Medical knowledge grows. Slowly, unevenly but determinedly. People don't find answers yet, but they find resilience. They plant fields again. They rebuild houses. They remarry. They sing. They laugh. They live. And as you leave one recovering town behind, watching smoke rise peacefully from chimneys, you feel the world shifting once more. The plague reshaped the landscape, socially, economically, emotionally. But something else is rising from the ashes of catastrophe. A hunger for learning, a spark of curiosity, a desire to understand the world beyond superstition. The next step in your journey will carry you into that spark, into the halls where students debate ancient philosophy, where scholars resurrect forgotten texts, where science and reason begin to grow through the cracks left by devastation. Europe has survived famine and plague. Now it begins to think. You leave behind the churchyards and village greens where plague-time grief still clings to the air, and follow a road that leads towards something quieter, not peaceful, not simple, but curious. After centuries of fear, famine, uncertainty, and improvisation, Europe stirs with a different hunger, the hunger to understand, not just to survive the world, but to explain it. And so you find yourself walking toward places where minds stretch farther than the horizon, where ink-stained fingers turn pages instead of soil, where ideas begin to gather like warm embers after a long winter. Your journey starts in a small town dominated by an ambitious stone building. Not a church this time, but a school run by clergy. Children sit on wooden benches, their backs painfully straight, chanting Latin declensions in unison. Amo, amas, amat. Their voices rise and fall like the tide, steady and disciplined, though one boy in the back clearly recites with the enthusiasm of someone who forgot breakfast. The schoolmaster walks slowly between the rows, his staff tapping the ground with each step. It's not for hitting, hopefully, but as a reminder that learning requires attention, lots of it. The lesson shifts from grammar to scripture interpretation. The teacher asks a question about the meaning of a line from Augustine. Several children raise their hands, others stare at the floor, hoping invisibility exists. You listen, fascinated, because medieval education is not about memorizing trivia. It's about training the mind to structure thought, debate, reason, and argue. It feels surprisingly modern, except for the part where writing implements are expensive enough that every quill stroke requires emotional commitment. You continue onward until the landscape grows busier, roads converge, inns cluster close together. Traders move steadily toward a city whose skyline bristles with towers, not defensive towers, but the spires of churches and the tall, narrow windows of emerging universities. Welcome to a true medieval centre of learning. As you enter the city, students swarm like migratory birds with bad haircuts. They wear long robes that look dramatic when billowing in the wind, but probably trip them twice a week. They carry books chained to belts, parchment wrapped in leather, ink pots swaying as they walk. You overhear one complaining that he spilled ink on his only good robe and now looks like a disgraced philosopher. Another mutters about rent prices rising again. A third recites Aristotle while dodging a cart, a combination as dangerous as it sounds. Your first stop is a lecture hall inside a monastic school. It's dim except for the sunlight spilling through high windows. Rows of benches creak as students settle in. The master, a scholar with a stern brow, and a beard that suggests deep familiarity with sleepless nights, steps to the front and begins reciting from memory. He quotes Aristotle. He cites Augustine. He cross-references with commentaries from Arab philosophers whose names ripple through the room like distant stars. Avicenna, Averroes, Alhazen. Their works, transmitted through centuries of translation, now reshape European thought with mathematical precision and philosophical daring. You listen as students debate the nature of the soul, the structure of the cosmos, the relationship between faith and reason. Scholasticism, signature intellectual style of the age, thrives here. It's a method of inquiry built on logic, questioning, and systematic argument. Students take detailed notes, though half spend more time arguing with each other under their breath. One in the front row gestures so passionately during a philosophical point that he accidentally knocks over his inkwell, splattering the student behind him. The victim sighs dramatically, as though academic violence is just part of the spiritual journey. Leaving the lecture hall, you enter the university courtyard. This institution didn't appear overnight. It grew from cathedral schools, monastic traditions, and the swelling waves of new knowledge carried in from crusader routes and trade networks. Students here come from across the continent: France, England, Germany, Italy, Spain, each bringing dialects, customs, and the perpetual complaint that tuition, in the form of rent, food, parchment, and bribes for better seating, is too high. In a smaller room, a mathematics master teaches Euclidean geometry. He draws triangles with chalk on a slate board, explaining ratios and proportions with precision. Students listen, brows furrowed, clearly wishing numbers came with illustrations of knights or dragons. Next door, a lecturer dissects classical medical texts, pointing to diagrams of anatomy copied from Arabic medical encyclopedias. He emphasizes the importance of humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Though you catch students exchanging sceptical glances, as if maybe the plague had taught them that humours do not always humour humans. You wander into a university library, and your breath catches. It's not enormous by modern standards, but in medieval Europe, this is treasure. Rows of shelves stacked with manuscripts bound in leather, their pages handmade, their margins decorated with colourful flourishes. Some books rest on chains to prevent theft. They're worth more than some houses. A librarian shuffles past, reminding students to wash their hands before touching parchment. He glares specifically at one student who looks suspiciously like he just ate roasted onions. In a corner, two scholars whisper in heated debate. One argues that Aristotle's cosmology contradicts scripture. The other insists that reason and revelation can coexist if interpreted properly. Their conversation spills into geometry, astronomy, metaphysics, ethics, politics, a web of intellectual curiosity that feels almost electric. You lean in, fascinated, though you pretend not to when one scholar asks if you happen to know Greek or Arabic. Spoiler, you do not. Leaving the library, you pass the quarters where students lodge. The buildings look respectable on the outside, but the moment you step in, you are greeted by chaos. Books, boots, clothes, and half-eaten food clutter every corner. Two roommates argue about who borrowed whose cloak without permission. Someone in another room practices lute music very badly, while a neighbour bangs on the wall demanding silence. A student groans over a candlelit desk, face planted in his textbook as though hoping learning occurs through osmosis. Another scribbles furiously on parchment, complaining that he has 3 disputations due by sunrise and has lost one of his quills. You slip into a public disputation held in the Great Hall. This is the medieval academic equivalent of a heated podcast crossed with a courtroom drama. Students stand before masters and argue propositions on theology, ethics, or natural philosophy. The masters challenge them relentlessly. Students counter with citations. The audience murmurs like they're watching a tense chess match. A young scholar makes a brilliant argument. The hall erupts in impressed murmurs. His friend slaps his back so hard he nearly drops his manuscript. The master raises an eyebrow approvingly. Academic glory achieved. After the disputation, you follow a group of medical students to a workshop outside town, where a local surgeon demonstrates techniques that straddle the border between cutting-edge science and medieval improvisation. He talks about wound care, boiling instruments, extracting arrows, and what plants reduce inflammation. He grimaces at outdated practices and praises newer, more evidence-based methods learned from Arabic physicians. His students listen eagerly, except when he pulls out leeches, at which point half of them pretend to inspect something very interesting on the floor. You continue your exploration through Europe's academic centres, the universities at Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, Padua, Salamanca. Each has its quirks. Bologna specialises in law. Padua excels in medicine. Paris is the powerhouse of theology. Oxford students complain more than average. Cambridge students deny it passionately. Wherever you go, you sense the same energy. Learning is expanding. Libraries grow. Philosophers correspond across kingdoms. Merchants fund schools. Nobles send sons, and sometimes daughters, to study. Scholars translate ancient texts from Greek, Arabic and Hebrew. Knowledge that once lived in monasteries alone now spreads through towns, cities, courts. Outside one university you meet travelling scholars, wandering academics who carry lectures from place to place, teaching in taverns, fields, churches or wherever students gather. They wear robes patched from miles of walking and speak with the weary excitement of people chasing ideas rather than comfort. One tells you he debated a bishop last month. Another boasts that he memorised entire sections of Aristotle during a long trip because there was nothing else to do. You nod politely, impressed and mildly concerned. Your journey doesn't stay confined to universities. Knowledge thrives elsewhere too. In a merchant's workshop, an apprentice uses new mathematical techniques for accounting. Arabic numerals, increasingly common despite traditionalists grumbling that they look too foreign. In a monastery, a monk studies medicine not just through prayer, but through observing plants and experimenting with remedies. In a noble court, astrologers and physicians argue about celestial influences on the human body. In a workshop, glassmakers experiment with new formulas refined through Eastern trade. You wander into a guild hall where craftsmen debate innovations in architecture. They sketch designs for churches with soaring arches and intricate buttresses. Their experiments with physics are hands-on, risky, and often described as "let's hope the wall doesn't collapse this time." Through these experiments emerges something extraordinary. Gothic architecture. Stone turned into music. Weight turned into light. Science isn't modern yet. Not even close. But something profound is happening. People begin to test ideas, compare sources, debate logic, observe patterns, write hypotheses, copy texts, travel for knowledge, share discoveries. Europe begins to think structurally, expansively, collaboratively. You attend an evening lecture where a scholar explains the movement of the stars. He charts planets on a wooden board, referencing Ptolemy and Arabic astronomers. Students sit enraptured, though one in the back is clearly asleep. The master doesn't scold him. Everyone knows philosophical exhaustion is unavoidable. Later, lantern in hand, you walk through a campus courtyard. Voices drift through windows, pages rustle, candles flicker. Somewhere a student recites lines to himself, trying not to panic before tomorrow's exam. Somewhere else, two scholars debate on a balcony, their silhouettes framed by the stars they're trying to understand. You stand there for a while, watching light spill from those windows, each one a small defiance against centuries of darkness. Not literal darkness, though candle shortages are a thing, but intellectual darkness, fear-driven darkness, survival-driven darkness. Europe is still fragile, still recovering, still confused. But here, in these halls, something shifts. Curiosity replaces despair. Structure replaces chaos. Thought replaces reaction. Students who study here will one day become clerks, advisors, physicians, architects, bishops, merchants, authors, innovators. They carry knowledge outward, spreading seeds of change into fields, courts, monasteries and towns. And as you leave the university behind, the night air cool against your skin, you feel the quiet hum of a civilization beginning to rethink itself, ready to turn learning into art, imagination into structure, and curiosity into a new foundation. Ahead lies the next expression of that foundation. Stone, glass, colour, form. Europe is about to build its thoughts into beauty. You leave the university quarter behind, stepping from the murmur of debate into the open air where sunlight slants across cobblestones like golden brushstrokes. Ahead, something rises from the skyline, soaring, jagged, luminous, as if the city itself reached upward and froze in a gesture of prayer. You've arrived in the heart of medieval creativity, where stone becomes poetry, where colour becomes theology, and where architecture speaks a language everyone understands, even if no one can quite translate it. Your journey begins in a workshop that smells of sawdust, sweat, stone dust, and stubborn ambition. Masons chisel blocks of limestone with a rhythm that sounds almost musical. Each tap echoes through the courtyard. The master mason oversees everything with an expression of gruff affection, adjusting angles with a glance, correcting apprentices whose lines waver, and muttering about how geometry is sacred but apprentices rarely are. You watch as he sketches a pointed arch on a wax tablet, a curve that seems simple until you try drawing one yourself, and produce what looks like a startled snail. This arch, he explains, will shape the ribs of a vault that will rise like a web of stone above congregants' heads. Combined with flying buttresses, those skeletal arms reaching outward for balance, it allows walls to thin, ceilings to rise, and windows to expand. And medieval builders do not waste a single inch of window. They fill them with glass so brilliant you half expect angels to float out. You step into the half-finished cathedral. Sunlight pours through coloured panes, scattering blues, reds and golds across the floor. For a moment, you stand still, letting the colours spill over your skin like warm water. People around you whisper, their voices swallowed by the vastness. Even labourers coated in dust and sweat glance upward with reverence as if they're not building stone but shaping heaven's waiting room. In one side chapel, artists paint frescoes. Brushes sweep across plaster in confident strokes, saints with solemn eyes, scenes from scripture, patterned borders that curl like vines, You watch as a painter grinds pigments, lapis lazuli for blue, cinnabar for red, ochre for earth tones. Each colour is costly, precious, chosen deliberately. The painter says blue is the most expensive, reserved for the Virgin Mary, a sign of devotion and bank accounts stretched to their holy limit. Leaving the cathedral, you wander through the streets where artistic expression spills out of workshops and guild halls. You step into a goldsmith's shop where delicate filigree adorns chalices, reliquaries, and jewellery meant for nobles who measure prestige by how shiny their accessories are. Goldsmiths work hunched over small anvils, tongues poking from the corners of their mouths in deep concentration. One shows you a ring carved with intricate knotwork. You admire it, but he shrugs. "This is nothing," he says. "Wait until you see the cross for the bishop." You do not see the cross. It's locked away to prevent artists from accidentally improving it. Across the street a scribe illuminates manuscripts. His quill dances across parchment, leaving behind calligraphy curls so precise they look woven. In the margins he paints creatures both holy and hilarious. Lions, dragons, rabbits wielding swords, snails confronting knights, a favourite medieval joke you try your best to understand. He laughs quietly when you ask why snails appear so often. "Because even a snail can defeat pride," he says with a twinkle. Or maybe medieval scribes just liked chaos. As you continue wandering, a sculptor chips away at a block of stone outside his workshop. Figures emerge beneath his chisel, saints, angels, mythical beasts, grotesques meant to frighten demons and amuse parishioners. One gargoyle in progress sticks its tongue out. The sculptor says it's meant to drain rainwater. You suspect it's also meant to judge anyone walking beneath it. Medieval architecture is multitasking at its finest. Beyond the workshops, you reach a marketplace filled with tapestries so large they require teams to unfurl. Scenes unfold across woven surfaces, battles, hunts, royal courts, biblical stories and everyday life. A woman stands beside one tapestry, fingertips grazing the threads as she explains the months of work required for each inch. You trace a tiny embroidered hound chasing a deer, marvelling at the textures created from wool dyed in plants grown by weavers' families. Then you head to a town square where a troupe of travelling performers sets up. Jugglers toss knives. A storyteller crafts tales of King Arthur, Roland and trickster foxes. Musicians play lutes, fiddles, and small drums. A dancer twirls in a circle, skirts spinning like a wheel of colour. Children sit in a ring, eyes wide. Adults pretend they're only there to keep the children company, but you see the spark in their gazes too. Storytelling softens the weight of work, taxes and plague memories. Art is the breath between survival. Still, the true pulse of medieval creativity lies not only in grand works, but in the daily expressions woven into ordinary life. You pass homes adorned with carved door lintels, each symbol telling a story. Family trade, superstitions, blessings. Potters shape cups and pitchers with decorative patterns, marking local styles. Tailors embroider hems with little motifs that blend charm and identity. People wear clothing dyed with plant pigments, walnut brown, madder red, weld yellow. Even mundane objects bloom with creativity because beauty, in medieval eyes, is as essential as bread. You travel further to a city known for its guild halls, imposing structures decorated with statues of patron saints, elaborate carvings and banners flapping proudly. Inside, guildmasters gather to evaluate apprentices' masterpieces. One young carpenter presents an intricately carved chest. He steps back nervously as masters inspect it, tapping joints, checking hinges, murmuring approval. He watches them with the anxious attention of a cat awaiting performance reviews. When they nod, relief floods his face. He's earned his status. He's earned his place in the city's fabric. Travelling north, you encounter the soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals in their full glory. Notre Dame, Chartres, Reims, Cologne, each rising skyward with defiance and devotion. You step inside one and feel the hush spread through your bones. Light dances across polished floors. Choir voices rise, echoing through ribbed vaults. Stone pillars stretch upward like forest trunks. Every architectural innovation whispers the same message. Lift your eyes, lift your thoughts, lift your spirit. In the corner, a stonemason stands quietly, staring at the vaults. When you ask what he's thinking, he replies, "How we manage this, I'll never know." He laughs softly, shaking his head. "We build for God, yes, but also for the future. These walls will outlive us." You realize he's right. These structures become humanity's most enduring conversations with time. Further east, you witness the rise of panel painting. Artists experiment with depth, shading, emotion, realism, small steps toward the Renaissance. You watch one painter mix pigments with egg yolk, creating tempera paint that glows when applied. On his panel, a saint's face emerges slowly, line by careful line, expression serene and somehow human. He tells you painting is prayer for the hands. You believe him. In a music workshop, minstrels practice polyphony, multiple voices weaving harmonies that once would have sounded rebellious, but now feel transcendent. A young composer proudly explains a new technique for notating rhythm, tapping the parchment like he's unveiling the future. He's right. Notation evolves dramatically in these centuries, transforming music from fleeting sound into preserved art. You continue your journey through smaller villages where creativity thrives in quieter ways. A woman weaves a blanket on a loom built by her grandfather. A man carves wooden toys for his children. A priest paints modest frescoes inside a humble church, his colours simple but filled with devotion. A girl sings while grinding grain, her melody drifting across the fields. Art lives in the soil, in the air, in the human impulse to create even when the world is unkind. Finally, as evening falls, you stand on a hill overlooking a city illuminated by torchlight. The cathedral glows from within, stained glass igniting like fire. Bells ring, music swells. From here, medieval Europe looks like a continent shimmering with imagination. Stone dreams reaching upward. Painted stories unfurling across walls, colours and voices swirling in every corner. Art and architecture don't just decorate this world. They explain it, elevate it, preserve it. They reflect what people fear, hope, celebrate, and endure. They turn belief into form, labour into beauty, memory into monument. And as you take one last look at that glowing cathedral, you realise the continent is preparing to shift again. Creativity will touch not only the sacred and communal, but the intimate, the halls where nobles live, scheme, feast, flirt, and maintain the elaborate rituals that shape their elite identities. The next steps of your journey will take you behind those heavy doors, into feasts, fashion, etiquette, and privilege, into the soft glow of noble candles where velvet whispers and power glitters. You leave the cathedral's glowing windows behind and follow a winding road that leads you away from the clamour of towns, across rolling fields, and toward a distant structure rising from the landscape with quiet confidence. It isn't a fortress meant for war, nor a church meant for worship. It is something softer, grander, more polished. A noble estate where people live in more comfort than most medieval folk can imagine, wrapped inside layers of etiquette as complex as any battle strategy. As you approach, the first thing you notice is the silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the curated hush of a world where everything is maintained, measured, and managed. A manor house rises at the centre, timber-framed or stone, depending on the wealth of the lord, surrounded by gardens, barns, stables, orchards, and a small army of servants who make the entire operation run so smoothly you might mistake it for effortlessness. Spoiler, nothing about noble life is effortless. It just pretends very hard. A steward meets you at the gate, a man with an expression permanently halfway between welcome and I'm counting how much trouble you might cause. He sizes you up, judges you benign, and escorts you inside. Immediately the world shifts. Servants hurry past with trays, fabrics, letters, and sometimes all three at once. A groom leads a glossy horse toward the stables. A cook shouts instructions that sound like culinary warfare. Laundry workers beat linens clean with the precision of soldiers. You step into the great hall, where daylight spills through tall windows. Tapestries soften the stone walls, each one flaunting the family's lineage like medieval Instagram posts. A broad hearth crackles, warming the room. Benches line the tables. This is the beating heart of noble life, not just for feasting, but for politics, negotiations, performances, and quiet rivalries conducted through carefully raised eyebrows. A noble woman sits near the fire, embroidering a cloth with gold thread so fine it glitters like sunlight. Her posture is impeccable. Her gown falls in perfect folds. Her expression is serene, with just a hint of, "I know the secrets of 5 nearby families." She greets you with gracious formality, offering just enough warmth to make you feel welcome, but not enough to suggest familiarity. In noble circles, warmth is a currency, carefully measured. A nobleman soon joins her, tall, dignified, wearing a tunic embroidered with animals that probably symbolise his claim to land, lineage, and general relevance. He carries himself with that practised ease nobles develop from a lifetime of being watched, judged, and expected to represent their families in everything from war councils to dinner seating arrangements. He shakes your hand firmly, then waves for a servant to bring wine. Sweet, spiced, and far better than anything you've had in villages so far. As you talk with them, you quickly realise noble life runs on rituals. Not religious rituals, but social ones. Endless, intricate, exhausting. Who sits where? Who speaks first? Who stands closest to the Lord? Who pours wine? Who bows deepest? Who uses which title? Etiquette here is a form of weaponry. A glance can wound. A misstep can ruin alliances. A misplaced greeting can start a feud that lasts generations. But noble life isn't all posturing. It's also performance. Gracious hosting, elegant conversation, tasteful clothing, and a social calendar thick with feasts, hunts, tournaments, and diplomatic visits. A noble household must appear prosperous even when it isn't. That means tapestries borrowed for special occasions, servants scrambling to polish tarnished silver, and cooks stretching ingredients into dishes that scream wealth, even if half the ingredients are vegetables pretending to be exotic. You follow the noble woman into the solarium, a room filled with light, cushions, and the faint scent of lavender. Here she and her ladies-in-waiting embroider, gossip, read romances aloud, or write letters sealed with wax so elaborately pressed it might as well be jewellery. They discuss fashion, politics, family alliances, and which nobleman showed up last week wearing hose that were too tight for polite society. You pretend to understand the layers behind every comment. You do not. You're invited to observe the wardrobe being prepared for the evening feast. Servants lay out bright gowns spun from imported silk, trimmed with fur and decorated with tiny pearls painstakingly stitched onto sleeves. The nobleman selects her dress carefully. Not too casual, not too formal, not too bold, not too timid. Fashion here is diplomacy. Every colour says something. Every stitch is strategic. You watch as she chooses a deep red gown, signalling confidence and wealth without sliding into arrogance. Meanwhile, the nobleman prepares for the upcoming hunting party. Hunting is not simply recreation. It is a demonstration of leadership, skill, authority, and connection to the land. He checks his bow, inspects the hounds, and discusses routes with his huntsman. Each detail is considered, each command sharp. You watch as he practices his draw, the bowstring singing with the crisp note of someone who has done this since childhood. Servants bustle around him, fastening his belt, adjusting his boots, brushing off dog hair he insists didn't come from his favourite hound. A stable hand tells you that nobles love their horses so intensely, you'd think each steed is a royal cousin. The hunt itself is a spectacle. You follow at a safe distance as riders thunder across meadows. Hounds bay wildly, horns blast, nobles shout to one another, half strategizing, half bragging. You hear laughter, curses, praise for daring maneuvers, and complaints that someone, took the jump too dramatically. Eventually a deer is caught, and ritual unfolds. Offerings to tradition thanks to the animal, shared pride in success. The hunt is bonding, it's status. It's politics disguised as sport. Returning to the manor, you witness the afternoon transition from activity to preparation. The kitchen explodes with motion, pots clattering, knives chopping, herbs sizzling in fat. The air fills with smells that almost make you forget how rarely medieval people bathe. Cooks roast meat, bake pies, grind spices, and stir pottage into thick, fragrant meals. You admire a pastry shaped like a castle, complete with tiny crenellations. The cook tells you it took 3 days and the patience of Job's grandmother. As evening arrives, the feast begins. The hall glows with candlelight. Servants pour wine. Musicians play soft melodies from the gallery above. Nobles take their seats according to rank, an arrangement that requires more planning than a military campaign. You sit near the lower end of the table, where the conversation is livelier and the pressure significantly lighter. Course after course arrives. Roasted boar, spiced fish, bread flavoured with herbs, sweet custards, fruit tarts, dishes decorated with edible flowers. A jug of wine appears at your elbow and does not leave. You're in danger of testing the limits of medieval digestion. Conversation hums. Nobles exchange witty remarks sharpened like arrows, but delivered with smiles. They discuss marriage alliances, trade agreements, rumours from the royal court, and the price of spices, always too high. One noble brags about his falcons. Another describes a recent journey to a neighbouring estate where the lord's new hall is an affront to both geometry and God. Entertainment follows. A jester performs acrobatics and jokes that dance dangerously close to insulting the nobility, but just close enough, never over the line. A troubadour sings of courtly love, his voice clear and sweet. Noble women listen with practised expressions of polite admiration, though you catch one rolling her eyes. After the feast, attention shifts to etiquette rituals, dancing, conversation, games. A group plays a board game involving strategy and mild cheating. 2 nobles compare rings with the seriousness of diplomats signing treaties. A noblewoman leans in to whisper something to her friend, both of them dissolving into suppressed laughter. But beneath the glitter, you sense the tension. Noble life is comfortable, yes, but fragile. A misplaced alliance, a failed harvest on their lands, a shift in royal favour, a feud with neighbours, all can topple fortunes. These halls are elegant, but they are arenas too. Later, you wander the manor quietly. You pause at the solar, where the noblewoman now writes a letter beneath candlelight. You peek into the library, modest but well kept, filled with manuscripts locked in wooden chests. The steward records inventory in a ledger, grumbling about missing spoons. The stable hands groom horses with gentle hands. The cook snores by the hearth, exhausted. Walking outside, you glance back at the manor's lit windows. Each one is a world: wealth, duty, ambition, containment. Nobles live lavishly, but not freely. They're bound to expectations, lineage, reputation, gilded chains, but chains nonetheless. You leave the estate through a quiet garden, where night-blooming flowers open under the moon. Crickets hum. A breeze stirs the leaves, and you realise your next steps will pull you from noble comfort into the heated world of conflict and transformation, where kingdoms clash, revolts ignite, and Europe's late medieval identity tears itself apart before stitching itself into something new. You leave the noble estate behind just as dawn presses pale light across the fields, and the world feels different, less like a tapestry of rituals and refined manners, and more like a drum roll steadily growing louder. The late medieval centuries are not polite. They don't glide, they don't bow, they crash, surge, fracture, and reassemble. As you walk between villages, towns, and battlefields, you feel a restless pulse beneath your feet, as though the very soil knows that Europe is about to tear itself apart and rebuild itself in the same breath. The first sign comes from the horizon, smoke curling upward, far too thick to be a hearth fire. As you approach the edges of a village, you find a handful of peasants huddled together, whispering about soldiers marching through the region. Not knights in glittering armour, but hardened men with mismatched weapons, carrying the wild look of people who've seen too much war and would prefer not to see more. The villagers speak nervously about border conflicts, wars that have begun to stretch not for seasons but for generations. Your path takes you into the shadow of one of the most drawn-out confrontations in medieval memory, the 100 Years' War. You first encounter it in a French hamlet, where a farmer explains that he's lived his whole life under the threat of English raids. I plant, he says, and then someone burns it. I rebuild. Someone burns that. I rebuild again. It's a conversation with misery. You nod quietly as he gestures toward the fields, showing patches where wheat should grow but doesn't. War leaves scars not just on bodies but on landscapes. Following the road north, you find an English encampment preparing for a campaign. Soldiers practice with longbows, pulling strings with the strength of seasoned hunters. A captain explains proudly that English archers can unleash volleys that darken the sky and puncture armour at horrifying distances. One archer lets you try his bow. You tug the string, your arm shaking, and he laughs so loudly you suspect the entire camp heard. "Don't worry," he says. "Took me years to draw it smooth. You'll get there." You decide not to pursue an archery career. Nearby, knights prepare their armour. But it's no longer the smooth, shining plate you associate with medieval romances. It's evolving. Articulated joints, reinforced breastplates, visors crafted to deflect arrows. Blacksmiths hammer late into the night, sparks flying, as they adapt armour to counter new threats. War is an arms race, even here. You walk with a group of soldiers marching toward a battlefield thick with mist. As it lifts, you see the grim choreography unfolding. Archers positioning themselves behind wooden stakes, infantry tightening formations, cavalry waiting for the signal that might send them into chaos. A commander, surprisingly calm for someone orchestrating potential catastrophe, explains the strategy: use terrain, time volleys, anticipate charges, stay flexible. Nothing about this feels heroic. Everything feels exhausting, dangerous, calculated. The battle erupts with a noise that seems to tear the air itself. Arrows hiss overhead, horses scream, men shout orders, shields clash. You duck behind a fallen log as a volley slices past. The ground churns under boots, hooves and bodies. For a moment you glimpse the raw truth of medieval warfare. Not chivalric duels, but confusion, mud, terror, and fleeting clarity when someone realizes they're still alive. When the battle ends, survivors move through the field in a weary haze. Some tend to wounded comrades, others pray. A young archer sits on a broken fence, staring at his hands as if they've betrayed him. You sit beside him. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. War is a language of silence as much as noise. Leaving the scorched field behind, you travel east toward regions shaken by conflict of a different flavour, social unrest. In a German town, you encounter a gathering outside the city gates. Peasants clutch tools repurposed as weapons. Their leader, a tall man with a voice that carries across the square, speaks of unfair taxes, corrupt officials, and lords who ignore their duties. He demands reform. He demands dignity. He demands what he calls God's justice. You realise you've stepped into the peasants' revolt, one of many such uprisings that shake Europe in the late medieval centuries. The grievances are familiar. Rising taxes to fund endless wars, economic pressure after the plague's upheavals, legal restrictions that feel increasingly unjust, and the stubborn refusal of elites to adapt. You listen as the crowd agrees to march. Some are hopeful. Others already seem afraid of what might come. Days later you find the march has grown. Hundreds join, then thousands. They carry banners painted with symbols of faith and solidarity. They chant demands for freedom, fair treatment and relief. You march with them until they meet an army of nobles whose gleaming armour reflects the setting sun. Tension thickens. Words turn into shouts. Shouts turn into clashes. You watch the rebellion crumble beneath professional forces, hopes scattering with the same fragility as dry leaves in wind. Standing amid the aftermath, you sense a shift in Europe's core. The social fabric has stretched thin. People question old hierarchies. Peasants and townsfolk realise their strength. Nobles realise their vulnerability. Kings realise their dependence. Everyone feels the tremors. Your journey then carries you north to the bustling streets of a Flemish city embroiled in urban revolts. Merchants and artisans unite to demand representation. They confront wealthy guild masters and city officials. The air crackles with ambition, tension, and the smell of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor who casually informs you that he's preparing for a riot later this afternoon. Walking west, you find England roiled by its own storms, the wars of the roses. Noble houses clash for the crown in battles that unfold like deadly chess matches. You visit a camp where soldiers wear badges of roses, red for Lancaster, white for York. One commander explains the tangled lineage claims to the throne, but by the third cousin twice removed, your brain taps out. You nod politely, hoping he doesn't test your comprehension. These wars feel different, more personal, more intimate. Kings are toppled, heirs vanish. Nobles switch allegiances with the elasticity of desperate acrobats. You watch a coronation where the crowd cheers loudly, though you suspect half of them secretly wonder how long this king will last. Closer to the continent, Burgundy rises with dazzling wealth. Tapestries, feasts, armour polished to theatrical shine, only to fragment under political strain. In Italy, you walk into city-states buzzing with ambition, rivalry and creativity. Milan, Florence, Venice. Power shifts constantly between merchants, mercenaries, nobles and popes. A scholar tells you Italy is a collection of brilliant feuds. You believe him. Further south, the Reconquista nears its end. You visit a town reclaimed from Muslim rule, where Christian settlers move into homes recently emptied. You hear the echoes of cultures layered across the centuries, Arabic poetry, Latin prayers, Jewish scholarship, a tapestry of coexistence frayed by conquest. The region feels both ancient and transformed, but some conflicts dwarf others. You travel to a fortress where Ottoman banners flutter in the hot wind. Soldiers drill with disciplined precision. Cannons, huge iron beasts, loom in the courtyard. Weaponry is changing. Gunpowder is here. The medieval world shudders. You follow the whispers of a siege that reshaped history. Constantinople, 1453. Though you weren't there at its fall, you see its influence long after. The last Byzantine stronghold collapses beneath Ottoman firepower, and the shockwave ripples into every European court. Refugee scholars carry Greek texts westward, fueling Renaissance thought. Trade routes shift. Fear and fascination intertwine in equal measure. Your path then leads you through quieter corners. Villages rebuilding after wars, markets recovering after raids, fields resown after armies trampled them. You watch a blacksmith repair tools instead of weapons. A town council debates taxes peacefully for once. Children chase each other with wooden swords, blissfully unaware that real battles scarred the roads beneath their feet. But Europe is not merely breaking, it's evolving. You witness new administrative structures emerging. Kings centralise power, parliaments and estates gain voices, courts refine legal frameworks. Bureaucracies expand with clerks, scribes, treasurers, and officials who complain about paperwork with medieval levels of passion. Literacy rises, printing presses begin to clatter. Books replicate ideas faster than monasteries can copy them. You watch a printer ink his first pages, smiling as the words set into the paper. This, he says softly, changes everything. Even warfare transforms. Gunpowder spreads. Longbows give way to handheld firearms. Plate armour loses its supremacy. Fortifications shift from soaring vertical towers to sprawling angular walls built to deflect cannon fire. You watch an engineer sketch star-shaped bastions and realise you're stepping out of the medieval and into something entirely new. And beneath the battles, rebellions, dynastic struggles, technological innovations and shifting borders, people keep living. A widow plants herbs where her husband once stood. A child learns letters from a travelling friar. A merchant saves enough money to buy a second wagon. A squire becomes a knight. A peasant becomes a landowner through sheer survival and circumstance. Lives, fractured by war, knit themselves back together. Standing on a hill at dusk, you look over fields, towns, and distant castle silhouettes. The world feels stretched, tense, unpredictable, yet brimming with possibility. Europe is shedding old skin, feudal bonds loosen, nations take shape, wars forge identities, knowledge spreads, trade networks widen, cultures blend and clash and intertwine. You take a breath, feeling the weight of transformation crackle in the air. The late medieval centuries are not merely an ending, they are a hinge, a turning point where everything old strains against everything new. Ahead lies the final stretch of your 1,000-year journey, the closing centuries where medieval Europe doesn't fade quietly, but metamorphoses into something poised on the edge of modernity. The wind carries a different scent now, less of wood smoke and horse sweat, more of ink, wool dye, spice, metal, and distant seas. You walk along a road that seems strangely modern compared to the paths you've followed for centuries. The ruts are deeper, the caravans heavier, the accents more varied. You've arrived at the final stretch of medieval Europe, the centuries when old structures wobble, new impulses surge, and the familiar world begins quietly dissolving into something recognisably modern. The first change you notice is movement. Not just people travelling, but everyone travelling. Merchants with carts stacked high, sailors heading toward ports, pilgrims visiting shrines with renewed energy, scholars crossing borders for newly opened universities, soldiers marching under banners of centralising monarchies. Europe feels restless, impatient, as if it's preparing to shed its skin but hasn't quite figured out how yet. You reach a bustling port city that didn't exist a few centuries ago. Now it's enormous, noisy and ambitious. Ships bob against the docks. Cogs, caravels, hulks. Vessels built not merely for coastal trading, but for long-distance ventures that stretch farther with each generation. Italian merchants argue over pepper prices. Hanseatic traders tally accounts in neat ledgers. Sailors unload barrels of wine, sacks of wool, bolts of silk, chests of sugar. The air swirls with scents that didn't mingle before. Cinnamon, salt, fish, resin, and opportunity. A Venetian merchant invites you to walk with him as he inspects incoming cargo. He talks non-stop about profits, routes, storms, taxes, pirates, the price of alum, and the fact that his cousin's new ship is a magnificent disaster waiting to happen. You ask if he worries about changing markets. He shrugs. Always. But change feeds us. Stagnation kills us. He says it casually, but you sense truth in his tone. Trade is no longer just an economic activity. It's a driver of cultural transformation. Leaving the port, you step into warehouses filled with cloth dyed in brilliant hues. English wool, Flemish weaves, Italian luxury fabrics. You watch workers stack bales with efficient rhythm. A foreman explains that wool profits feed kings, fuel wars, enrich towns, and shape politics. Cloth is power. Textiles are currency. Merchants now influence rulers almost as much as nobles do, sometimes more. In the streets outside, artisans from all over Europe mingle. A German metalworker shows off a new lock design. A French carpenter demonstrates a more efficient saw. A Spanish leatherworker cuts patterns with geometric precision. Ideas cross borders like birds following seasonal winds. The medieval world, once bounded by local horizons, now cracks open. But trade is only one thread. The next change crackles through workshops, scriptoria, and city squares with the unmistakable smell of ink and innovation. You follow that scent to a small, cramped room where a man stands before a machine of wooden beams, metal screws, and inky plates. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. Not the only one anymore, but the spark that lit every other. You watch printers arrange movable type letter by letter. Ink-smudged apprentices lock pages into frames. A crank is turned. Press, release, lift. A sheet of paper holds words identical to the last, replicated perfectly, effortlessly, scandalously fast. Textbooks no longer require monks copying for months. Knowledge multiplies like wildfire. A young woman, unusual for her era but increasingly common, purchases a printed book of prayers. A merchant buys a volume of arithmetic. Students crowd around pamphlets containing philosophical debates. A priest picks up a treatise he isn't sure he entirely approves of. A scribe stands nearby, looking personally betrayed by the existence of the printing press. You leave the workshop with your ears ringing from the sound of future revolutions being printed one page at a time. Travelling north, you reach towns where guilds still hold power but face new pressures. Journeymen demand more rights. Masters struggle to preserve standards. Some guilds adapt, others crumble. Urban life shifts, not disappearing, but evolving. Stone houses replace timber. Market squares expand. Town councils grow sharper, more bureaucratic, more insistent on shaping their own futures. Then there is the quiet shake beneath everything. Kings building states. You enter a royal court where clerks in long robes fill shelves with records, taxes, land surveys, laws, decrees. Kings now command not just vassals but administrations. They send officials across the realm. They standardize coinage, reform courts, enforce borders. You see maps drawn with increasing accuracy. You hear heated arguments about central authority versus local privilege. A noble mutters that the king is getting ideas above his station. A clerk mutters that nobles are behind the times. You stay neutral, both look like they bite. Across the channel, you see England's parliament sharpening its identity. In France, the monarchy expands through cunning diplomacy and determined warfare. In Spain, unification takes shape through marriage alliances and military campaigns. In the Holy Roman Empire, princes and electors maneuver around imperial authority with practiced ambiguity. Europe is slowly becoming a continent of nations, messy, contested, unfinished, but unmistakably forming. Innovation doesn't stop at politics. You visit workshops where engineers test improved cannons that roar with terrifying power. Castles once proud now stand vulnerable. Stone walls crack under artillery fire. Military strategy shifts again. No more dominance of armoured knights. Infantry armed with pikes, longbows, or firearms rise in importance. You watch as a knight removes his helmet after a demonstration, sighs, and mutters that gunpowder has no respect for tradition. In Italy, you step into cities blooming with creativity. Florence, Venice, Milan. Workshops hum with painters, sculptors, architects, humanists. You see artists experimenting with perspective, capturing depth, shadow, realism. A painter describes how geometry can make a flat image feel like a window to the world. A sculptor shapes marble with precision that seems impossible. A scholar pores over translations of classical texts brought from Byzantium after its fall, rediscovering forgotten philosophies. Humanism takes root. The study of humanity, languages, ethics, history. People read texts not only for devotion but for debate, curiosity and pleasure. A student recites Cicero with enthusiasm that borders on reckless. A teacher rolls his eyes affectionately. Across Europe, music transforms too. Polyphonic compositions grow richer, harmonies layered like woven silk. Instruments improve. Choirs fill chapels with complexity unthinkable in earlier centuries. In cathedrals, organ pipes boom like living thunder. You travel further, reaching remote villages where old medieval rhythms persist. Farmers still plough fields, women still bake in communal ovens, children still chase chickens, but even here, change whispers. New crops appear, like the humble potato starting its slow spread from the Americas, though most Europeans don't know what to do with it yet. News travels faster. Taxes shift, laws expand, roads improve, the world pushes inward even as it stretches outward. Then, one morning, you reach a hill overlooking a bustling crossroads. Caravans from Africa, ships from Asia, merchants from the Mediterranean, scholars from universities, pilgrims from sanctuaries, all passing, all trading stories and goods. Medieval Europe, once fractured and localized, now stands on a threshold. Behind you lies 1,000 years of struggle, faith, creation, destruction, and resilience. Ahead lies a horizon where exploration, science, reform, empire, and revolution all wait in tangled silhouettes. You take a deep breath. This is the final page of the medieval chapter, and the first whisper of the world to come. The road quiets beneath your feet as evening folds gently across the landscape, softening everything it touches. The fields you've crossed, the towns you've wandered, the halls you've entered, they all dim into silhouettes, their sharp edges easing into calm. The noise of armies, the hum of markets, the debates of scholars, the chants of priests, all those sounds melt into the hush of twilight, like the world exhaling after a long, weighty story. You find a small rise overlooking the countryside and you settle there, letting the last light warm your face. The air cools, slow and soothing. A distant church bell rings one final note. A horse nickers somewhere in a nearby stable. A hearth crackles behind a cottage door. Each sound becomes softer, like the world tucking itself in. You stretch your tired limbs, feeling the miles you've walked through centuries. Let the rhythm ease. Let each breath slow just a little further. You've crossed 1,000 years. Hardships, triumphs, plagues, prayers, battles, discoveries. And now all those moments drift like lanterns on a quiet river, glowing gently as they float into memory. In the hush that settles, imagine the soft glow of candlelight drifting from a medieval window. Imagine the low murmur of a lullaby carried on the breeze. Imagine the stars coming out one by one, the same stars medieval travellers looked up at when the world felt larger, darker, and full of wonder. Now let the night wrap around you like a warm cloak. Let the journey slip into stillness. You've seen the rise of kingdoms, the fall of empires, the heartbeat of ordinary lives. You've reached the end of the medieval road. All that's left is rest. Slow breath in, slow breath out, and sleep gently, traveller. Your story is safe.